In late spring, Owen was called to sort out various legal affairs to do with his father's death. He was finally deemed old enough to properly deal with the complications of being orphaned, and so he left that morning with an uncertain disposition. "It's not like they're going to ask you about his death, or some shit like that," Levi said, frowning up at Owen as he waited for a carriage to pick him up. He'd be gone the entire day, and though he promised to be home before dark, Levi didn't count on it. "It's not that," Owen said slowly. He looked around nervously, his body rigid in fear. "Levi, I need you to promise me something." "Yeah?" Owen turned to face him. His face was hard, and his eyes were firm and cold. "Be careful," Owen said, his voice brisk and almost reprimanding. He stared at Levi for a very long time, and it was clear in the way his mouth parted that he had much more to say. But the carriage pulled up, and Owen was left to stare intensely at Levi's face. "Yeah, whatever," Levi said. He shoved his hands into his pockets and turned away. "Have fun." "I'm serious. I'm not going to get into any trouble, okay?" Levi shook his head and waved back at Owen. "I'll be fine." He walked home without bothering to look back. He'd see Owen whenever he returned, and that was fine. Until then he could find a nice, quiet place to read. Or maybe he'd actually play with the other children for once. Yes, that sounded nice. Not that he was sure about racing Klaus or anything like that, but it would be nice. "Hey, grumpy face," Trudy giggled as he made his way up the road to the orphanage. The majority of the kids were playing ball in the street. "Is Owen gone, then?" "Yeah." Levi shrugged. "He'll be back later." "He's so busy," Trudy whined, pouting a little. "It's not fair. He should come play with us more often." "You both should," Hild piped up, kicking the ball to Levi's feet. The girl smiled warmly. "It's nice to see you outside, Levi." "Yes," Rosie agreed. "It's nice to see you active." "I'm sorry," Levi said earnestly. "I just don't feel up to games." "You can watch," Klaus offered, appearing at Trudy's side. He had a goofy smile on his face. "I mean, if you don't want to play. I'm just glad, that you ain't cooped up in the house. You're too quiet, man." "I'm only quiet because I've got nothing to say to your ugly pig face, Klaus." "There we go." Klaus chirped, clapping Levi's shoulder. He was taller than Levi now, which was odd. "That's the Levi we love." "Don't touch me." "Oops." Klaus looked a little sheepish as he released Levi. "Sorry." Trudy prodded Levi's side, and he glared at her. "You've gotten really skinny." Trudy gasped, pinching his ribs. "It's kinda gross." He shoved her very hard. "Don't think I won't beat the shit out of you," Levi said in a low voice. "Because I'm more than willing to skull drag you from here to Wall Maria." "Whoa," Trudy whistled. She held up her arms and giggled. "So scary." "Or, quit it, Trudy," Lynette said, her plump face appearing beside Trudy's. "You're so mean to him." "Why am I the mean one?" Trudy asked, giving a huff of exasperation. "Levi's plenty mean too." "Yeah, but Levi's only mean because you provoke him," Hild pointed out. "Yes," Rosie agreed. She had cut her hair very short in comparison to Hild's, likely to place a decent amount of difference in their features. Even so, the twins looked uncannily similar, and it was difficult to remember which one was which. "You are mean because you want to be." "Levi is mean because he is defending himself." "Levi's not an angel, Trudy cried, waving her arms around as she whined. Klaus laughed beside her, and the rest of the children began to crowd around. Without Owen and Henri, there were still 9 children in all. 9 very raggedy, very underfed children. But what could be done? "Come on," Klaus said, kicking the ball to Levi's feet. Levi stared at it blankly. "Try one game." "I told you I'm not feeling up to playing dumb games." Levi kicked the ball back to Klaus, and he turned toward the door. He felt a vacancy crawling inside him. It was beginning to fill up with a silly sort of warmth. He paused at the door and he looked up. He blinked rapidly at the crevices and laid into the wood, and his body began to loosen. But, I mean... He struggled to find the words that would suit him. If you really want me around, maybe later I can read to you guys. You know how to read. Klaus blurted. Trudy snorted in disbelief. Since when? Do you want me to read you a damn story or not, shitface? Levi snapped at her. Fine, she laughed, flinging her arms into the air. I'm sure this'll be good. Shut up, Trudy, Doug said quietly. Owen taught him. Levi didn't ask how Douglas knew that. He went inside alone, resting his back against the door and staring into the entryway with furrowed eyebrows. It was difficult, but he was beginning to accept what had happened. To Henri, to him. Did I ever thank Owen for saving me? He wondered. There was no certainty to it. After all, he had been very lost in his own thoughts since recovering from the illness that almost claimed his life. As Levi was washing his hands, Miss Harmon poked her head into the bathroom. Oh, she sighed, tucking a strand of wiry grey hair behind her ear. There you are. Owen's gone, then. Yeah, Levi said. He scrubbed at his knuckles and he shrugged. He said he'd be back tonight. That boy is never around, is he? Miss Harmon shook her head, and she rested her shoulder against the doorframe as she watched Levi scrub. You two are close, aren't you? Ah, Levi said, pausing in his efforts to eradicate the scum from beneath his fingernails. I dunno. Sure. Sir. Miss Harmon sighed, and Levi listened to her with bated breath. He knew Miss Harmon could be very nurturing, but he was so used to her caustic personality it often stunned him. What has he told you? Levi flicked off the faucet, and he spun to face the woman. His face was impassive, but his insides were twisting. What do you mean? He asked slowly. Did he tell you why he's here? Miss Harmon asked hesitantly. Yeah, Levi said. His dad died. I mean, why else would he end up in a shitty orphanage, no offense? None taken, Miss Harmon said, her lips tightening into a hard line. Mind your mouth, Levi. Yes, Did he tell you how his father died? Miss Harmon asked hesitantly. Yeah, Levi said, scratching absently at the pallid skin of his knuckles. But I'm not sure if... I know, Miss Harmon said. I know everything. I just wanted to clarify before speaking with you about it. Levi stared at the woman, and he looked down at his hands. Suddenly they felt very dirty, and he couldn't place why. So he merely scratched at them harder. Oh, he said faintly. What about it? Well, for starters, Miss Harmon said, does he seem all right to you? Yeah. Levi bit his lip. He didn't like this at all. He's fine. Why? Going through his father's things will be a trial, Miss Harmon said softly. For a boy who suffered such heavy abuse, I'm just worried. I think someone should have gone with him. I would have, Levi said, if he asked. But he didn't. He wanted to be alone, and I don't blame him. Miss Harmon sighed, and she looked almost reluctant to broach upon the topic. You don't find him strange, do you? Miss Harmon asked. Levi's eyebrows rose. I mean, you don't find it odd that he's so distant? He likes being alone, Levi said, shifting with discomfort. I know, Miss Harmon said, and that's what concerns me. What is this really about? Levi asked, his eyes narrowing. I just find it strange, Miss Harmon said. He said he got a job, and I trusted that. He seems like an honest boy. He even bought your shoes, Levi. Levi looked down at the new boots, which were firm-soled and comfortable. So unlike the awful oversized scum collectors his last pair had been. Sir? Levi asked. He knew where this was going, and he didn't like it. So Miss Harmon said, I need to know where he's actually getting the money. I refused to take the money when he first approached me about it, but I've only just found out. He feeds money into the orphanage account monthly. Well, really? Levi wasn't really listening anymore. That's nice, isn't it? Miss Harmon shook her head furiously. That boy might have good intent, but I won't stand for the devil's work funding this orphanage. Devil's work? Levi repeated, scoffing. Owens, he wouldn't be doing anything terrible, he's too damn nice. Don't get me wrong, Miss Harmon said. I love Owen. He's very sweet, and I'm definitely indebted to him now, but I can't let whatever is going on happen any longer. Nothing is happening, Levi said instinctively. And he wanted to believe it so desperately it hurt. Why couldn't Owen just stop whatever the fuck he was really doing? Levi scratched at his knuckles thoughtlessly, his eyes darting away from Miss Harmon's face. I know you're lying, she said. I don't know why, but I know you are. Levi, you're bleeding. Levi had scraped his fingernails too hard against his peeling knuckles, and he blinked as a little blood pooled around the stinging flesh, coagulating in crevices of skin. He whirled around, shoving his hands beneath his forehead and flinging the water on. The pressure was aching, and it felt as though his bones were bending backwards as he scrubbed at his hands with a mechanical fury. He needed to get them clean, he needed to get the blood off, he needed to. Levi! Miss Harmon cried, grabbing his wrists. There were tears stinging his eyes when she pulled his hands from the bursting cascade that burned his bleeding knuckles, and she forced him to look her in the eye. She slowly slipped into a kneeling position, her wizened hands grasping the burgeoning redness that trailed across his tiny ones. Oh, Levi. I'm so sorry. What? His eyes flashed wide, and he yanked at his arms, feeling stupid and ashamed. Why? I knew there was something bothering you, Miss Harmon said, but I thought it would fade. I never thought that. That what? His eyes stung with tears, and his face was flushed and burning. Let me go. He yanked back, and he stumbled as Miss Harmon released him. Blood was slick on her fingers and his own, so he ran back to the sink. The bite of the water against the exposed cuts hurt in a way that sent a shiver down his spine. Miss Harmon waited patiently as the tears overwhelmed him, and a sob bubbled up inside his chest, tearing from his mouth. He didn't know what had brought this onslaught of emotional turmoil, but he was so afraid and so angry and so ashamed, he felt as though the sobs were morphed into a sickness. His sobs were stifled by his hands clapping against his mouth, a motion that made him lurch in horror, and though the blood had been washed away, he could taste it. He could taste the contamination, the death, and he could taste the bar clawing at his throat as he gasped and chirped and sobbed. Levi, she said when he quieted down. He didn't look at her. He didn't dare. She grasped him by both shoulders, turning him around gently, and he squeezed his eyes shut when she wiped at his tears gingerly with the pad of her fan. I don't know what exactly it is that is troubling you. But I need you to know that you aren't alone. Okay. He couldn't speak. He couldn't even breathe properly, but he nodded in spite of himself. Because Levi had no idea what else he could do. She hugged him then, and he was too stunned to fight it. So instead, he buried his face in her shoulders and let himself be held. Just once. Later that night, when Levi was calm and all evidence of his breakdown was washed away, he sat on his bed with a book in his lap. The 8 other orphans sat around him, listening intently as he read aloud the fairy tales Owen had entrusted to him. They all looked at him with varying degrees of interest, and they listened without complaint. It was almost unreal. He'd never had such rapt attention put on him, not in such a positive way. And it made him feel a little anxious and exhilarated. The tin soldiers stood there dressed in flames. He felt a terrible heat, but whether it came from the flames or from his love he didn't know. He'd lost his splendid colors, maybe from his hard journey, maybe from grief, nobody can say. Levi spoke as if in a daze, with his lips moving mechanically and his eyes trailing across the page with a strange amount of ease. There were no words in this story that were particularly challenging, and so he felt very comfortable reading it aloud. He was being watched by 9 pairs of eyes, including those of Miss Harmon, who stood in the doorway. She was smiling, he saw, glancing out of the corner of his eye. He smiled back gratefully. He looked at the little lady, and she looked at him, and he felt himself melting. But still he stood steadfast, with his musket held trim on his shoulder. "No way," Trudy gasped, bouncing on the edge of Levi's bed. "No way, no way. I thought you said these were fairy tales." "They are." Levi pressed his thumb to the line he had left off on, hoping not to lose his place. "But this is so sad." "Someone saves him," Hild said nervously. "Right? I can finish the story," Levi said. "There's only a paragraph left. But I don't want to know if he dies." Trudy whined, clapping her hands over her ears and shaking her head. It was very hard to believe that she was older than Levi sometimes, with the way she acted. Why can't they all be happy? "I don't know, Trudy," Levi said earnestly. "I don't think it works like that." "Of course it does," Trudy sniffed. She wasn't crying, but she looked a little disgruntled. "I hate this story. Tell a happy one." "Let him finish." Klaus gasped, elbowing Trudy in the ribs. "Yeah," Levi teased, closing the book with his thumb stuck between pages and bonking his foster sister lightly on the head. "Idiot, there's only a paragraph left." "That hurt." Trudy powdered, rubbing her head. "I bet." "Wimp," Klaus taunted. Trudy shoved him so hard he fell off the bed and toppled onto the floor, laughing all the way. Levi smiled as the others began to laugh as well, and he flung his pillow at Klaus's face when he tried to get up. Klaus shrieked with dismay as the twins grabbed him by each arm, and two of the younger kids, Riley and Mara, flung their arms around his neck, yanking at him. Klaus bellowed, half laughter and half pain, and he wriggled beneath their grasp. "Get in." Trudy cheered. Lynette laughed beside Douglas on Owen's bed, across from Levi's. She clapped her hands amusedly, while Douglas merely managed a meager smile. Perhaps he was too old for the play wrestling to be amusing. Levi didn't know. "Okay," Levi said. There was a knock at the door, but Levi ignored it as Miss Harmon disappeared into the foyer. About time, he thought. They were all in their pajamas, preparing to go to bed, and Owen was more than a little late. "I'm going to finish this damn story if it kills me. Get these crazy little shits off me." Klaus gasped, wincing at the grip of the younger children. Levi sighed, and he tossed a book onto his bed, letting it fall open to the page he had marked. He stood up, but as he did so a scream ripped through the house. They all froze, the feeling of the scream hitting them hard as they all held their breaths and listened intently. Had that been real? That was the question floating through their minds as they tentatively looked toward the entryway. "Miss Harmon," Lynette said weakly, pushing herself to her feet. Douglas stood up as well. He gestured for Lynette to stay where she was, and he slowly crept toward the entrance. He immediately stopped as another scream split through the house, followed by a stomach-lurching thump. Douglas blinked and took a step back. Levi didn't understand what was happening until it was too late. The room was suddenly swarmed with people. Some of them Levi recognized as they broke through windows, their faces half-shadowed, but most of them were strangers. Demons in the night coming to devour them all. Through the entrance of the room, 3 men came rushing in. Douglas had no time to react as he was tackled to the floor, a knife burying itself to the hilt in his heart. The screams that ricocheted off the walls were immeasurable. Levi was in a panic, and he was completely frozen in shock and fear and confusion. This couldn't be happening. How could it? It wasn't possible. But there was blood congealing in the crevices of the floorboards, and all around him there were strange men who had knives, and Levi saw one go into Hild's right eye, and he watched her scream in agony as the knife was yanked out, and then she was grabbed by the hair, her neck exposed and bent to meet the bite of the blade. Blood burst from her neck into Levi's face. He was standing just beside her. Klaus was still on the ground, his own soft-looking face half obscured by spluttered blood smeared across it. His mouth was agape, but no sound came out. He looked too stunned. The 2 younger children, Riley and Mara, went scrambling, but a man grabbed Mara, and Levi found himself lurching to help, but it was too late. He saw the knife protruding from her back as her screams died into strangled rusts, tears welling inside her eyes. Riley was sobbing. "Get away," he shrieked, shoving and kicking as he was pinned down. Levi jumped on the man pinning him, his skinny arms locking around the man's neck, but he was thrown off easily. Levi smacked his head against a wrought iron footboard, and he sat dizzily as Trudy grabbed him and yanked at him, screaming something inaudible into his ear. And then Levi realized why these faces were so familiar. Eren Jaeger stepped up behind Trudy, and he watched Levi with his eyes glinting as his blade sunk into Trudy's spine. Levi's muscles were locked. His breath was caught. No. No way. It couldn't be real. It was a nightmare, a dream. And yet, Trudy's wide-eyed gaze was suddenly becoming very dim, and she opened her mouth, her lips trembling. She coughed, and blood sprayed across Levi's face like a sprinkle of red freckles licking at his cheeks. This isn't... Levi grabbed Trudy's body as she slumped, and he found himself screaming too, calling out names in spite of himself. He dropped Trudy when he saw Klaas, who was running. He was weaving between men, his face streaked with blood and tears, and he met Levi's eye. "Run," he cried. There was only silence then, and Levi stood shakily with Eren Jaeger standing before him, Trudy's corpse bleeding at his feet. There were so many of them, and Levi didn't recognize them all, but there was Nickel Main and his friends who had beaten Levi up, and there were others. Others who Levi had seen with Owen. Owen, Levi thought, his eyes widening. He felt sick with the revelation. No way, he can't be a part of this, "You remember me, don't you?" Eren asked. Levi lurched forward as Klaas was caught, and Levi's screeching went unnoticed as his foster brother's throat was opened ear to ear. Blood spilled across the floorboards, and there was nothing done. Levi felt cold. He could hear his own heart as it crashed against his ribs, rising up into his throat and crushing his larynx. He couldn't speak or scream anymore. He was shoved backwards into the wrought iron frame of the bed, and he nearly fell onto Trudy's corpse. "She asked you and Owen to join us once," Eren said, holding up his bloody knife. "It's really a shame you didn't join too. None of this would have happened if you had." Levi was too stunned to shake. He was too shocked to breathe. He stared up at Eren, and then he looked at the knife. "But honestly," Eren continued, giving a haughty smile, "you have Owen to thank for all this." He danced around the room with the air of a performer, his eyes still glinting with an evil mischief. It was all the confirmation Levi needed. He had no senses from that point. Only a clear view of what the facts before him were. These men were evil, and they had destroyed everything Levi had ever loved. And Owen was one of these men. Owen did this, Levi thought madly, his fists shaking in rage. He did this, he's the reason they are all, he couldn't bring himself to think it. He knew they were all gone, every one of them, because he could see it, feel it, taste it slushing in his mouth. Death was seeping through the windows and leaking on the floor. Levi stood up straight. His eyes were wide. The world seemed so simple all of a sudden. When Eren reached for Levi, it was all Levi truly needed. He twisted his arm so fast that the bone snapped beneath Levi's touch, and the man buckled as the knife was yanked from his loosened fingers. Levi stood as tall as he could, and he flicked his wrist as he clutched the blade, his entire body reacting as he kicked Eren in the groin and slashed him across the throat. Blood splashed downward, hitting Levi's face in a hot strain. But he didn't care. He kicked the man aside, clenching the knife tightly as he looked around. There were so many of them, but it was suddenly all a blur. He was faster than them and smaller. And he was so much more willing to kill than they were, despite all evidence pointing to the contrary. No. Levi would slaughter them. He took each one and put them to the knife like the swine they were. He moved like death sweeping across the room, collecting his reaping of blooded throats and fading eyes, and he kicked their bodies into a pile in the center of the room. When he was done, he was soaked from head to toe, his eyes and teeth the only indication that he wasn't some blood-caked monster torn from the depths of hell. Levi slid down the wall in the corner of the room, clutching his knife and heaving deep breaths. His lungs felt as though someone or something was crushing them with hot iron, and he couldn't think clearly. There was buzzing. There was laughter. There was a story of a molting tin soldier searing inside him, and he felt he was the same, bubbling over and bursting as he melted away into oblivion. There was nothing left of him but hollow eyes and a hollow heart. Levi never saw Owen after that. He had never appeared back at the orphanage, and the MPs had stuck Levi with Greta Schatz by default. Schatz had been kind, there was no mistaking it, but Levi had been a terror to live with, and he'd hated her for being there. Eventually he learned to live with it, but by then he had moved out and begun to form his own criminal reputation. In the end he wasn't sure if he was any better than Elray Charnel had been. Levi awoke with that thought haunting him. He was in a cot, cold sweat causing sheets to stick uncomfortably to his skin. His head was pounding so terribly that he gritted his teeth and squeezed his eyes shut. His limbs felt awkward, cumbersome, and heavy. He was aching all around, his breath short and his heart pounding. He'd lost sense of where he was. His thoughts were still muddled up in a bloody little corner, staring vacantly ahead until MPs came to ask him a lot of really dumb fucking questions. He took a deep breath. Had it all been a nightmare? Would he awake at home, on the couch, with Mikasa awake and eager to please him? The thought of Mikasa stung his heart, and he sunk into the cot he was lying in, missing the girl more than he'd ever missed her before. She had always been the perfect distraction when he had a nightmare. She was always a rock for him to latch onto, to make sure he stayed tethered to the world around them. But he had no Mikasa now, right? The memories of joining the Survey Corps flooded his head in a very sudden, very sharp burst of light. His eyes snapped open, and he choked on the bitter, chilly memory of rain slipping down his cheeks, of the blade against Owen's throat, of the Titan Levi had killed, of the fall that had disoriented him to the point where he could not move. "Oh, are you awake?" Levi's blood ran icy in his veins, and his breath hitched painfully inside his throat. He stared up at the ceiling of whatever clinic he was in, focusing solely on the off-white hue and the strange speckled texture. He didn't want to look at Owen. He didn't want to see the man's smug fucking face, lest Levi beat it in with his bare fists. It was not that Levi was entirely angry, on the contrary, he was exhausted and mostly immobile, but Owen triggered something inside of him that made him want to destroy everything in order to just end his pitiful excuse for an existence. "I have a few questions to ask you," Owen said calmly, as if nothing had happened, as if they were merely acquaintances. "If you don't mind sitting up for me." Levi had to take a deep, shuddering breath before he forced himself onto his elbows. It was as far as he could go without his ribs screaming in protest. "What's your name?" Owen asked. Levi looked at him sharply, and he saw that Owen wasn't even looking at him. He was reading a book in his lap, writing on a clipboard as he spoke. The scritch-scratch of the pen was scathing to Levi's ears, which felt clogged with cotton. "You're shitting me," Levi stated, his voice a startlingly sharp croak. "Just answer." Owen did not look up. Instead he continued to write, his eyes moving from his book to the clipboard. Levi pushed himself upright despite the body-racking pain, and he stared at Owen with a stare so hard and piercing that it caused the man to pause. He looked up, his bold blue eyes meeting Levi's. "Levi fucking Ackerman," Levi said. "I'll assume you did not, in fact, legally change your middle name to fucking," Owen said placidly, turning his attention back to his clipboard. "Though, knowing you." "Shut up." Levi's fists clenched the sheets around him. What the hell kind of question was that? "Just protocol," Owen said, shrugging. "You've been out for longer than 12 hours, so I'm only checking your cognitive receptors. Basic information." Levi said nothing. It hadn't even occurred to him that Owen was just checking if he was okay. It was hard to stomach, and Levi wanted to leave the room so badly that he found himself checking his surroundings for the nearest exits. "The door is behind me," Owen said, his ability to read Levi's thoughts uncanny. "There's a window beside the bed, but there's a bit of a drop. Of course, you'd have to get through me to leave." "I can take you," Levi said in a low, dark voice. Owen looked up, and he actually smiled. "Oh," he said, "I don't doubt it. However, I'm your superior, and assaulting me would look even worse for you. You barely scraped freedom with your last stunt, Levi, and I wouldn't suggest pushing it again." That pushed Levi right over the edge. "I want to kill you," Levi said. He let his tone slip in a slow, bored cadence. "I hate you so much, and I want you to choke on your filthy blood when I slit your throat." Owen sighed. He closed his book and set it and the clipboard on the ground. He looked very composed for someone whose life was in grave danger. "Who the hell are you?" Levi wondered. Maybe if Levi ripped him open and tore out his entrails he would find out. "That's a little barbaric, Levi," Owen said. "And I would honestly prefer it if I lived, thanks." "What the hell are you playing at?" Levi snapped, his ribs aching as he lurched forward. Owen watched him so calmly that Levi looked around for something to hurl at his head. "I want to kill you. I tried to kill you. Am I in prison? Because I should be in fucking prison." "Calm down," Owen said, holding up his hand. "Yes, you were a little jittery when we were on the mission. It's not unusual to be scared on your first expedition." "I wasn't scared, damn it." "Yes," Owen said, his voice sharp, brisk, and commanding. "You were. You were very scared, and you ran away. But obviously in the end you proved yourself quite adept. After all, you took down a Titan while concussed. I fell off a roof onto my ass." "I thought the storm would come later," Owen admitted. "My mistake for not pulling back sooner." "I still would have tried to kill you," Levi said steadily. "I'm going to keep trying. I don't care. So lock me up now, Owen, or I swear you'll regret it." Owen studied Levi's face as if he was a puzzle he couldn't quite crack. There was a great amount of curiosity there, but also a little bit of wonder. "I know already that you blame me," Owen said slowly. "I know you jumped to conclusions when I didn't come home that night." "Shut up." Levi stared ahead of him and he scratched at his knuckles subconsciously. "Don't you dare, you bastard." "They wouldn't let me see you," Owen said. Levi couldn't look at him, so instead he looked around for anything he could use as a weapon. But there was nothing around him but a nightstand with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight on it. And that was a little too precious to soil with Owen's blood. "Shast, you know. Every day I kept asking if I could talk to you, but they just said that you weren't stable enough. I didn't realize what that meant until an MP told me that you murdered 13 people. They deserved it," Levi said immediately. It was what he'd always justified to himself when he thought about the people he'd killed. "Yeah," Owen said. "Maybe. In all honesty, I was scared to face you after that. Because you knew I'd tear that smug look off your face." Levi asked, looking at him. "No," Owen said. He paused and he shrugged. "Actually, maybe. It was a long time ago, I'm not entirely sure how exactly I felt. But I do know that it was my fault for being part of that awful gang, and I do take full responsibility for what happened." A confession, Levi thought numbly. He hadn't expected this. "Why?" Levi asked, staring at Owen's face with a look of pure disdain. "Why kill them all?" Owen shook his head. "I've wondered that too," he admitted. Levi stared at him, his jaw clenching in frustration. "I think it was to teach me a lesson. It was a message meant to tell me that bad things happen when you don't pay your debts." "What debt?" Levi rubbed his head, the feeling of his bandage making him uncomfortable. Owen glanced at him and he leaned back in his seat. His neatly parted hair was falling into his forehead in limp blonde clumps. How long has he been sitting here, anyway? Levi honestly didn't want to know. "I owed the gang a very large debt," Owen said slowly. "I had them procure something for me I wouldn't have otherwise been able to get my hands on. When it was time for me to repay them, I couldn't give them what they asked for." "What the hell did you ask for?" Levi asked, slumping a little. His bloodlust was now more like a senseless hum in the back of his head. "Drugs." "Yes, actually," Owen said. "A special drug. That cured a very persistent illness." Levi's felt stones collapse into his stomach as the weight of his words hit him. "Oh," Levi thought, feeling sick. "Oh. That's how he did it." Levi had always wondered, but it had never been a thing that had truly pestered him. Not until now. Suddenly it made sense. It was twisted and it was cruel, but it made sense. "Sir." Levi's mouth felt dry as he spoke. "What did they want you to give them?" Owen said quietly. He folded his hands in his lap and he raised his chin higher as he tilted his head ever so slightly. There was a strange resignation to the way he leaned back, his shoulders slumping. "You," Owen said. It didn't register. "Excuse me." The silence stretched out for a few moments, and in those few moments it slapped Levi across the face. His eyes widened and he sat up straighter, his mouth dropping open. "They thought they could traffic you," Owen said quietly. It sounded as though he was admitting his deepest, darkest secret, and Levi couldn't stand it. He couldn't deal. "Don't ask me what they meant to do with you when they got you." "I didn't ask. I told them that they couldn't have you or any child from the orphanage, and then, well, I left a few days later. They took advantage of that." "Shit," Levi breathed. He sunk into his bed and he stared ahead of him vacantly. Oh, he thought, "Mikasa, we have so much more in common than I ever imagined." "I'm not sure if it changes how you feel," Owen said. "If you still want to kill me, tell me now. I'll give you a knife. You can slit my throat if that's truly what you want." Levi stared at him as he pulled out a small, skinny knife from inside his boot and held it out to Levi. It was the most stunning sight and the most horrific. "But you should know, if you kill me there will be consequences. You will be imprisoned and likely executed. And you will die without ever seeing your daughter again." That caught Levi's attention. He felt the word daughter as it sent a jolt through him, like a bullet through the heart. Hanj always referred to Mikasa as Levi's daughter, but it was always different with her because it was Hanj. She got carried away easily. But with Owen it was like an undisputed fact being spoken. Mikasa was Levi's daughter. "How the hell," Levi hissed, "do you know about her?" Owen blinked. "Is it a touchy subject?" he asked. "I'm sorry. But it's true. You won't see her. You'll die and she'll be left alone in this world." Again, Levi thought. He closed his eyes. Now that he was sitting and digesting all the information being fed to him, he knew there was not a chance in the world he'd attempt to kill Owen again. And though Levi held an undeniable amount of distaste for Owen Smith, he couldn't help but be awed his loyalty. If he's telling the truth. But it was already settled in Levi's mind. His heart was pounding inside his head as he raised his eyes to Owen's. He took the knife from his palm and rolled the grip of it between his fingers. "You know," Levi said, his voice carrying an almost lofty quality, "I kept the knife I used to kill those bastards." "Oh? Yeah." Levi peered at the skinny knife and he gritted his teeth. He twisted his body, a burst of pain crippling him as he stabbed the knife into the bedside table just beside the faded book the Mikasa had gifted to him. "I gave it to my daughter." He tested out the word and spat it out with a strange hesitance. He wasn't sure if he liked it. "That's a strange gift to give a young girl," Owen said. He looked amused. "I'm sure a toy sword would have suited her fine." "How the hell would she defend herself with a toy sword?" Levi asked, wrinkling his nose. "That's just stupid. Because the knife he used to murder 13 people is a more practical gift for a child. Do you have any children?" Levi snapped. Owen looked a little surprised, but said nothing. "Nope, didn't think so." "Don't lecture me about things you don't know." "Fine." Owen leaned forward, and there was a hint of a smile on his lips. "Does this mean you'll follow me?" "If I was going to kill you," Levi said, "I would have done it by now." Owen smiled wider. It was strange. It was so utterly surreal to no longer have a burning sense of hatred inside him at the mere memory of this man. Now all that was left in that space inside him was an empty sort of glaze. A feeling of loss and a foundation for forgiveness, or something akin to that. Levi would not kill Owen, no. But Owen needed to earn Levi's trust again. That was certain. An envelope slipped into his lap. He stared at it, and he saw Mikasa's small, neat handwriting immediately. He shot Owen a look. "You stole my mail." "I was curious," Owen admitted. "I saw the name Ackerman." "Was that her mother's name?" "She's not my real daughter, Owen," Levi sighed. "I took her in." "Ah." Owen tilted his head. "I was curious about that too. I never imagined you might have a child." "I didn't plan to adopt," Levi said stiffly. "It just happened." "I don't know. You just happened upon an orphan girl." "Something like that." Levi tentatively opened the envelope. "How sweet of you," Owen said. "I'm glad to hear you found another family, Levi." Levi's fingers froze as he withdrew the letter. He stared at it for a long time, and his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Family," he said, tasting the acidity of the word as it burnt the inside of his mouth, hissing through his teeth. "Yes," Owen said. He watched Levi, and he tilted his head, his face looking especially severe as he raised his chin. "I know it might be hard for you to accept, since you so clearly hate me. But I lost my family that night too." Levi swallowed his anger. No, snapping would not help him. "Family," Levi thought bitterly. "Mine and yours. But that changes nothing. They are all still dead." "I'm not going to coddle you, Owen," Levi said, tearing his letter from its envelope. "But I won't condemn you either." "Eloquent," Owen noted, smiling wanly. "Shut up." Levi unfolded the paper, flattening it out against his knee. Per usual, it was very short. He found himself reading the words without truly digesting them. They fluttered vaguely inside his mind before truly taking purchase. And when they did, his entire body coiled with tension. He gripped the corners of the letter, the paper crunching a little under the pressure. "What is it?" Owen asked. He had the balls to sound worried. Levi shook his head. He inhaled sharply through his nose and forced himself to loosen his muscles, his shoulders slumping. He did not want to talk to Owen right now. He would prefer it if the man simply left. But Levi understood that things needed to change. He couldn't be a little shit about Owen's presence if he planned on sticking with the Survey Corps. He stared into his lap as he offered the letter out to Owen. He said nothing when Owen took it, and instead closed his eyes and felt Mikasa's words settling like rocks inside his stomach. Owen scanned the letter, and there was a blanket of silence between them as they both seemed to accept the gravity of their situation. "I'm sorry," Owen told him, resting the letter beside Levi's leg. He glanced at it, and the words shone as if the ink was glistening on the page. "Levi," it said. "It's been a while, hasn't it? I know you're very busy, but I thought it best to tell you now. By the time you read this letter, I will be part of the 104th Trainee Corps. Though your approval would be appreciated, I understand it's not all that likely. Also, I don't need it. Forgive me if you can. Mikasa." He had never imagined that this might happen. It had never crossed his mind that Mikasa might follow him into the military. Why would she be so foolish to seek out her own death? How could she be so reckless as to disregard her own life just to follow him into hell? They were so alike, and Levi despised it. "Don't be," Levi said quietly. He took the letter in his hands and found that they were shaking. "She's a fool." "We are all fools, then," Owen observed. Levi had taken a moment to compose himself. He was consumed by guilt, because if he had just stayed with Mikasa, then she would never have even dreamed of joining the military. "Yeah," Levi said. He folded up the paper and shoved it back into its envelope. He felt sickened and suddenly very empty. His head was buzzing with pain. There was a small sting of resentment toward Mikasa, but it faded fast. Yes, Mikasa, he thought, setting the envelope on top of his book. How could I ever forgive you for following me so blindly? Is she strong? Owen asked. He sounded very distant. Levi wasn't sure if he felt much animosity at all toward him at the moment. He was focused on the thought of Mikasa facing mortal peril regularly. Yeah, Levi said. Pretty strong, I guess. And she'll join the Survey Corps, I imagine. Like she'd fucking joined the military police brigade, Levi said stiffly. She hates them just as much as we do. I won't sugarcoat it, Owen said. He looked very grave. There is a very good chance you will see her die. If you survive long enough to see her don the wings of freedom. Oh, Levi said harshly, don't worry. I'll be alive. Owen smiled, and it was small and sad. I hope so, he said earnestly. Levi glanced at him. Before he could tell Owen that he still really kind of hated him, the door burst open behind him. Han swooped into the room, looking like a mad woman as she grinned broadly, hugging a stack of paper cups in her arm as she held up a bottle of alcohol. Good morning, Sleeping Beauty. Han crooned. Her eyes fell on Owen, and her enthusiasm only seemed to drop slightly. Oh. I'm interrupting. Nope, Levi said, sitting up straighter. For once, her energy was welcome. As was her alcohol. You couldn't have better timing. You did say you wanted to see me drunk, right? Han's eyes widened and she beamed at him. Yes, she cried, hopping onto the edge of his bed. Owen looked reserved and uncertain. Don't drink too much, Levi, Owen warned. I can hold my liquor, Owen, Levi retorted. He felt like a child all over again. He learned, in the end, that he could not hold his liquor as well as he thought he could. Chapter 11. The Snow Queen. She stood erect as Keith Shoddy stopped in front of her. His eyes were cold and harsh, and she stared into them with a measured gaze. Name, he barked. Mikasa Ackerman, sir, she said. He studied her face for almost a full minute before passing her by. She watched in apathy as he intimidated, rounded upon, and then promptly verbally and or physically attacked trainees. This did not surprise her, but she did have to wonder why he had skipped over her. It could be anything, really, so she decided not to dwell on it. They were dismissed soon after a girl was sent to run rounds until she was near death. Mikasa took her free time to devise a letter to Levi, though she was not sure she would actually send it. She was certain Levi was furious with her for joining the military. Not that he had any right to be. In all honesty, she could live with Levi hating her, so long if it meant she could be near enough to him to protect him if need be. At dinner she wrote a letter so long, it spanned 3 pages front and back. She wrote everything on her mind and spilled her heart onto the pages and wondered vaguely if Levi would roll his eyes and scoff at the words. It was this image that convinced her not to send it and what pushed her to write more and more. When dinner was over, she gathered up her things slowly, her mind still buzzing with words she wanted to write. She didn't know what she would do with the letter. Maybe she would burn it. Or tear it up. Or both. She bumped into a boy on her way out, thoughts of Levi's wrath entangling her thoughts and senses. Her letter spilled onto the floor, and she sighed, bending down to pick it up. Her skirt pulled around her feet as the boy spluttered in surprise. Oh, he gasped, hey, I'm sorry. He bent down beside her. Wow, I'm stupid, I saw you coming, I just didn't move. Wow. He picked up the first page of her letter, as well as her book of fairy tales. She felt his eyes on her face, and so she looked up at him. His face was very long, and his hair was pale, and it fell limply across his forehead. His eyes were wide, and she could see perspiration glistening against his pores. I've never seen anyone like you before, crap. He winced, and she blinked confusedly at him. He looked away, his shoulders tensing up. Sorry, he mumbled. You have beautiful hair. Thanks, Mikasa said hesitantly. He was looking at her letter, and she felt herself stiffen in defense. He looked at Levi's name, and she saw his entire face transform. Nervousness bled into anger, which morphed into disappointment, and then defeat. She was partly stunned by the display of emotions, but mostly she needed him to stop looking at her letter, because otherwise she was prepared to break his wrist to get it. She held out her hands expectantly, and when he continued to stare at the letter, she cleared her throat. I need those. Oh. The boy tore his gaze away from the letter and handed it and the book back to her. Right. Sorry. You have nice handwriting. Not really, Mikasa said, rising to her feet and moving past him. He sat on the ground and stared up at her as she moved. But thanks. She walked out of the mess hall, hugging her book and her letter tightly to her chest. Subconsciously, she touched her red ribbon to be sure it was still there. Then she touched her wrist, where the woven band made from her old red dress was tied. Her neckerchief was not around her neck, and her throat felt a little bare without it. Taking note of her previous blunder, she dodged a boy walking in front of her by whirling around him when he stopped abruptly. He glanced at her, his grey eyes narrowing a little at her face. He said nothing as she passed, but instead studied her warily. And then he grabbed her arm. Instinct snatched her up without mercy, and she exhaled sharply, a scream perched upon her tongue as she whirled around, her leg flying out. She heard him speak hesitantly before her shin landed between his legs. Hey, your name is Ackerman, right shit. Mikasa stared at him as he went down with a cry of pain, curling into the dirt. She opened her mouth in shock and mentally berated herself for attacking him. That isn't how you make friends, Mikasa, she chided herself. She dropped to her knees beside the boy, her dark skirt melting into the ground around her. I'm sorry, Mikasa said weakly. Shit, he groaned, rolling onto his back. His brown hair curled around his eyes, and he choked a little on a chuckle. Ow. I'm really sorry, Mikasa said, biting her lip. I don't do well with people grabbing me. His arms rested against his lower abdomen as a few other trainees stopped to stare at them, whispers flying against the night. He opened his eyes and smiled weakly. Sorry, he said, his voice thick with pain. I was going to talk to you at dinner, but I got distracted. He sat up, wincing a little as he took a deep breath. My name is Eren Jaeger. Mikasa nodded, plucking up the pages of her letter before they blew away. I'm Mika, she froze. Something slimy slithered into the pit of her stomach. Like a bad memory, it choked her and left her feeling queasy and stunned. She looked at Eren sharply. Did you say Jaeger? He nodded eagerly, searching her face. She was startled to find he was smiling a little, looking just as stunned as she was. My dad was your doctor, he said, his eyes wide. She felt a chill run through her like a sword burrowing into her abdomen. We went to your house and He glanced away. Yeah, Mikasa said distantly. There was a short pause between them, and Mikasa found herself wanting to put a lot of distance between her and the stranger. She didn't want to remember that day. But he was forcing her to go back, to watch an axe come down, to hear her mother screaming. He broke her revere with the caustic quality of his voice. I'm so sorry, Eren Jaeger said, his shoulders tensing up as he stared at her with his eyes burning with intensity. We looked for you everywhere. I went out to look every day after my dad gave up. Eren blinked and glanced away sheepishly. Yeah, kept telling me that there was little chance for you to be found without any clues as to who took you, but we still tried. Thank you. Mikasa said softly. Someone was looking for me, she thought numbly. I wasn't alone, even before Levi. I wasn't alone at all. That means a lot. He shrugged. I'm just glad I found you, he said, picking up her book and handing it to her. She took it gratefully. His eyes grew very concerned, and she was further stunned. Did those guys hurt you? She shook her head. She paused, thinking back. They had hurt her, hadn't they? Well, she said hesitantly. Maybe a little. But I was saved before anything too awful happened. He nodded and held out his hand. After staring at it for a long moment, she took it and nodded as well. I'm glad to hear it, he said earnestly. Then his eyes brightened up. Wait until finds out. She helped him to his feet, and she ignored the fact that she did not know who Armin was. I'm sorry, she said again. For kicking you. No, it's fine. He let go of her hand and waved his own casually. I shouldn't have grabbed you. Yeah. She glanced away. Don't do that again. I won't. He dusted himself off and looked around at the spectators who had paused to watch the exchange. Mikasa noticed the boy who she had bumped into earlier was watching from the steps of the mess hall with a haunted look in his eyes. What the hell are you all looking at? She turned away to hide a smile. For a moment, he almost sounded a bit like Levi. Though his voice was much harsher and louder and angrier. It was a familiar sort of callousness, though, and she wondered if perhaps she had made a friend after all. The next day Mikasa easily hung from the cords attached to her belt. It was much simpler than she could have ever imagined, and she tried to imagine what it might be like to swing with maneuver gear. Hey, a boy said, stepping in front of her when she was released. He was small and slender, his blonde hair framing his round, smooth face. He smiled a little and he waved amicably. You're Mikasa Ackerman, right? Yes, Mikasa said. She turned around when she felt someone gently toss the braid that rested at her back. Hello, Eren. Your hair's pretty long, he said. Mikasa pulled her braid over her shoulder to examine it. It was tied tightly into a bow with her red ribbon. I didn't notice, she said. I guess it is. You know that can get you into an accident with the 3D maneuver gear, right? Eren asked, peering at her. I'll take my chances, she said, tossing the braid back over her shoulder. Eren shrugged. Suit yourself, he said. He jerked his chin at the blonde boy in greeting. You did good, you know. Really? The boy asked, his eyes widening. I felt like I was going to fall over the whole time, honestly. Didn't look like it, Eren said, clapping the boy on the shoulder. Aren't you up next? The boy asked. Eren blinked and he twisted his head. Oh yeah, he said. Guess so. Be right back. Mikasa watched Eren leave and she listened as the boy exhaled softly. He's really confident, he said quietly. He turned to look up at Mikasa and he smiled again. My name is Amin Arlolt. Oh, Mikasa said. She nodded slowly. Eren said something about you helped him look for me. Amin smiled wider and he nodded. It's so strange, he said, giving a little laugh. I mean, we tried so hard to find you, and when we stopped looking you just appear out of nowhere. It's kind of amazing. Thank you for looking, Mikasa said. You and Eren are complete strangers to me. We weren't trying to be creepy. Amin said nervously. No, that's not it, Mikasa said. I meant, why bother? She stared down at the boy. Why put so much effort into trying to find a complete stranger? Oh. Amin blinked rapidly and he stared at her in wonder. Why wouldn't we? I don't know. Mikasa turned her face away from him. I guess. I'm just surprised. This world is very cruel, after all. I'm sorry you feel that way, Amin said, still smiling weakly. She looked at him and she noticed how the smile did not reach his eyes. He looked very sad. I understand, though. But don't you think, her own tiny voice echoed back at her from the catacombs of her memory, that maybe it can be beautiful too? It's people like you too, Mikasa said, who make me reconsider the way I feel about the world. She felt him jump as if she had slapped him. She decided to move forward after that, blinking as a group of trainees watched Anne. She followed their gaze and her eyes widened. Amin appeared beside her and they both stared as Eren hung upside down, his expression one of shock and distress. That's not supposed to happen, Mikasa observed quietly. Amin said nothing. He stared at Eren with a look of horror upon his face. Mikasa twisted the woven band around her wrist and frowned. After Shoddy's proceeded to chew Eren out about how to properly hold his body, Eren was let down. Amin immediately went to Eren's side, slinging the boy's arm around his shoulder. Mikasa realized Eren was bleeding from the head, and she watched as Amin buckled under the taller boy's weight. She continued to watch, fighting an internal struggle. They were both complete strangers to her. And yet they had cared about her without ever seeing her face. They had looked for her when she had been kidnapped. These two boys she didn't know had genuinely cared about their safety before she had even known they existed. Mikasa moved to En's other side and hefted up his arm, slinging it across her shoulder. Armin looked up at the suddenness of the weight being lifted off him, and he stared at Mikasa with his blue eyes large and glowing with awe. His brow furrowed, and he smiled slightly in gratitude. They dragged Eren away from the crowd, and Armin directed to where their bunk was. "Thanks," Armin said, pulling some gauze from a drawer. Mikasa had no idea where the gauze had come from or how Armin had known it was there, but she was grateful. Eren sat, staring dazedly into nothing. "He's so silly sometimes. He has a tendency to get himself into situations like this." "It's the least I can do," Mikasa said gently. She peered at Eren's face. "Will he be okay?" "He'll be fine," Armin sighed, carefully pushing back Eren's hair in order to properly administer the gauze. "He's just shocked, I think." Mikasa nodded. She leaned against the beam of a bunk and she turned away. "If that's all," she said, "then I'm going to go." "That's fine," Armin said. He was focused on the gauze, but he jerked his chin in acknowledgement. "Thanks again, Mikasa." Mikasa paused at the door, and she let her hand rest against the door frame. She turned her head to peer back at Armin, and she found herself debating once again. "I'll save you 2 seats at dinner," Mikasa said gently. She paused and turned her face away. "If you'd like." "Oh, that'd be great." Armin gasped. "Thank you." Mikasa nodded, leaving the room. She smiled slightly to herself. How strange it was, the sudden charge of energy at the mere thought of mattering. Her existence had been enough to send 2 boys searching, and she felt guilty that the search had been fruitless. She was glad, though, because at the very least she had something to cling to. A little pinch of home that lingered in the determination of children. Yes, she was very grateful for that. She wrote a new letter to Levi at the dinner table, briefly summarizing her encounters with Eren and Armin, and she knew she'd never send it. By the time the 2 of them had actually shown up, she was nearly finished with it. Armin plopped Eren down beside Mikasa and then moved around the table to sit across from him. He sighed, shaking his head a little in disbelief. "Go ahead and try and talk to him," Armin said, setting a plate before Eren. He pushed it farther in front of the boy when he didn't budge. "He's completely oblivious." "Does this happen often?" Mikasa asked, glancing at Eren's face. He still looked dazed and mortified. "No," Armin said. He shook his head fast. "No way. Eren's never this quiet." "Have you tried to snap him out of it?" Mikasa asked. Armin stared down at his own plate, and he pushed around the chunks of potato in his stew. "Well, not really. I'm a little scared too." Mikasa stared at her letter pensively. "Eren," she asked, setting her pen down. The boy stared vacantly ahead of him, his lips parted in a stunned sort of gait that left his face looking utterly imperceptive. Mikasa heard Armin give a little sigh. "Eren." "I told you," Armin said, shaking his head. "He's completely..." Armin gave a soft cry of horror, his chair flying back as he jumped to his feet, and his body curling in alarm as Mikasa's fist collided with Eren's cheek. He went flying out of his chair, falling into a crumpled heap against the wall. He blinked rapidly and flung himself upright, his eyes ablaze. "What the hell?" he snarled at her. "Mikasa, why would you do that?" Armin squeaked as she rose to her feet. She noticed how the mess hall grew quiet. That was interesting. She stepped up to Eren, and she saw the fury in his eyes. "Are you angry?" Mikasa asked. "Fuck yeah, I'm." She offered out her hand, her own eyes boring into his. "Then be angry," she said sharply, "and don't mope around like a lamb for slaughter. You look stupid." Eren stared up at her, his eyes growing wide. She could feel his rage, and she could also feel the eyes of all the trainees in the room burning at her back. She kept her hand extended and her head high, and she let herself be as calm and frigid as a winter sky before a storm. Then, to her satisfaction and honest surprise, Eren gave a short laugh. He nodded curtly and caught her wrist in his fist. "I guess I do look pathetic, huh?" he asked as she pulled him to his feet. He rubbed his cheeks and winced. "You really strong?" Mikasa whirled around, her eyes scanning the room. She watched as every eye averted from her gaze, and she wondered if this was how Levi felt. "Sorry for hitting you," Mikasa said quietly. "I think I needed it," Eren said, sitting down. Armin still stood, looking stunned and fearful. He stared at Mikasa for a long time, his mouth agape as if he wanted to say something, but he couldn't bear to let the words out. Mikasa sat down beside Eren. "You had confidence in yourself this morning," Mikasa said. "Too much, maybe, but so what? What the hell are you going to accomplish if you act like a zombie every time you fail?" Eren looked at her, and then he looked at Armin. "Okay," he said. "Okay, you're right. I've got to get through it. No moting." "Good." Mikasa looked at Armin, and she saw that he still looked a little confused. "I didn't mean to scare you." "No," Armin said, waving his hands anxiously. It's I just wasn't expecting you to do something so violent." Mikasa glanced away as he sat down, looking around anxiously as the hall filled up with soft murmurings. "Sorry," she said once again. She didn't know why she was apologizing so much, but it seemed only right. She had to remember that these boys did not know her or Levi and couldn't possibly understand her thought process. "I'll try not to hit him so hard next time." Eren choked a little on his stew, and he clapped his hand against his chest as he coughed. "Next time?" Eren asked. "Discipline requires pain." She gently flicked the bandage beneath his hair. "Which is another reason not to mope about what happened today." "Oh, okay," Eren said. He was staring at her strangely, and she bowed her head, wondering if perhaps she needed to tone herself down. She was around new people, and it was probably wrong of her to be so quick to bruise. "Hey, Mikasa," Armin said tentatively. I'm sorry to ask, but where did you learn to hit like that?" "Yeah," Eren said, twisting in his chair to look at her. "How are you so strong? Can you teach us?" "Hey." Armin flashed, and he shook his head furiously. No, I don't think I'd be able to hit anyone like that if I tried." "I'm not sure if I could teach it anyway," Mikasa said. She looked down at her letter once again and rested her cheek against her fist. "It wasn't something I learned." "Oh," Eren said. He looked a little disappointed, but he shrugged it off. "Well, anyways, you're right. If I'm gonna join the Survey Corps, I've gotta endure whatever is thrown at me, right? Even some dumb obstacle like this." Mikasa looked up from the letter, letting her fist drop from her cheek. "You joining the Survey Corps?" she asked. She couldn't help the squirming feeling in her stomach. Will he last out there, she wondered, or will he just be another meaningless death? She didn't want to face her own fear of the job she was preparing to take. Eren nodded eagerly, tearing into his bread and smirking. "Yep," he said after swallowing. "I'm gonna eradicate the Titans. Every last one. That seems unrealistic." Eren's smirk fell, and he glanced at her. He made a derisive noise, like a scoff mixed with a snort. "Yeah?" he asked. "Well, where are you gonna go, miss? I can do everything better than everyone." "Don't call me that," Mikasa said quietly. "Well?" Eren asked. He wrinkled his nose. "Don't tell me you're gonna join the military police." "No," Mikasa said. "I'm joining the Survey Corps too." "Really?" Armin asked, his eyes widening. He shared a look with Eren, a glance that could not be read by Mikasa, and then he looked back at her. "Why?" Mikasa shook her head. She folded up her letter and tucked it under her arm as she scooped up her plate and cup. "I have no other choice," she said, rising to her feet. "I've given myself no other choice." She moved to clear her plate, but a girl appeared in front of her. Mikasa recognized her from the bunch she shared with several other girls, and she watched as the brunette beamed at her eagerly. Her warm brown eyes were hungry and glowing. You're not gonna throw that out, the girl said, pointing to the bread still sitting on Mikasa's plate. Are you? Mikasa looked down at it. And then she looked back up at the girl. Oh, she said. How silly of me. Mikasa balanced her cup against her plate and picked up the bread. The girl stared at it eagerly, reaching for it with slow fingers. Mikasa tossed the bread into the air and caught it between her teeth, spinning away from the brunette and inwardly smirking at the noise of distress the girl made. That night, as the other girls chatted restlessly, Mikasa pressed her back to the wall of her upper bunk, reading idly from her book of fairy tales. There were 4 other girls who shared the loft with her: Sasha, the brunette from earlier, 2 small blondes, and 1 dark-haired girl. One of the blondes was sitting with her legs slung over the edge of the loft, staring ahead of her with a bored gaze as the girl with dark pigtails tentatively, but amiably, chatted with her. The other blonde was somewhere on the ground. Until Mikasa realized she wasn't. Excuse me. Mikasa looked up from her page to stare at the tiny girl. Her hair fell against her face in silky yellow tresses, and she looked up at Mikasa with her hands splayed against her knees. She had a stranger about her, as if she was afraid to speak, but couldn't help it. At the ladder, another girl lounged, her darkened complexion sprinkled with faint freckles. The girl glanced at Mikasa with an acute gaze, and Mikasa stared back. Yes? Mikasa asked, addressing the blonde girl. That book, the girl said softly. I recognize it. Mikasa glanced down at the book in her hands. Oh? The girl nodded eagerly, and she folded her hands in her lap. I read it when I was little, she said, her eyes wide and bright. It's got so many wonderful stories. Yes, Mikasa agreed. She stared at the girl for a long time, studying her round, beaming face. Gently she closed the book and offered it out. You can look at it if you want. The girl grasped the book with tiny hands, and she turned it toward her, examining the cover closely. This copy looks so much older than mine was, she murmured, running her fingers across the faded inscribed title. The other girl hopped up onto the loft, crouching over the blonde's shoulder. Doesn't look like much to me, she said, her voice coarse yet lilting. Oh, it's wonderful, the blonde said. The girl smiled at Mikasa, and she tilted her head. Which one is your favorite? I'm not sure, Mikasa said. She hugged her knees to her chest and thought about it for a moment. I think I like the one about the tin soldier. I remember that one, the girl said. It's so sad what happens in the end. Yes, Mikasa agreed. But it's a nice story. What is this thing even about? The freckled girl asked, snatching the book and frowning at it. Fairy tales, the blonde said meekly. The freckled girl wrinkled her nose. Fairy tales, she scoffed. They are really good, the blonde said quickly. She looked back at Mikasa with wide eyes. Aren't they? I like them, Mikasa said. She wasn't sure if it was because Levi had introduced the stories to her, or if she genuinely liked the stories. She couldn't tell the difference. Let's hear it then, the freckled girl said, crossing her legs and raising her chin. I want to know if this book is all that you're griping about. Oh, the blonde gasped. Oh, I don't know. The freckled girl shoved the book back in Mikasa's face. You read it? Wimia. The blonde looked a little frantic, and she waved her hand in apology. I'm sorry, you don't have to, it's... I'll read it, Mikasa said, taking the book. She looked at the blonde, and she rested the book against her knees. What story is your favorite? Oh, she said. I like the one about the Snow Queen, actually, but... She said she'd read it, didn't she? Wimmy climbed her hand on the blonde's shoulder, causing her to jump a little. Come on, Krista, let the girl give it a go. Krista looked at Mikasa with her large blue eyes glowing with a mixture of guilt and amusement. She smiled weakly as Mikasa opened the book, carefully flipping through the pages. As she flipped through the book, Wimia studied her face. Hey, you're the chick who punched that kid into a wall. Yes, Mikasa said. Wimia snorted, and Krista looked a little horrified. That was you? Krista asked, her eyes wide. But that boy was already injured. I'm sure he'll be fine, Mikasa said. I hope so, Krista murmured. Why? Wimya asked, peering down at Krista's face. You don't even know the brat. Well, no, but... I'm going to start the story now, Mikasa said. Her hair was loose across her shoulders now, and she tied her ribbon around her bicep for safekeeping. Wimya and Krista quieted and looked at her expectantly. So she clutched the book and began to read hesitantly, story the first, which describes a looking glass and the broken fragments. Krista looked very eager to hear the story, while Wimya looked rather bored and turned her head to look at the other duo on the loft. Mikasa watched for a moment before returning her attention to the page. You must attend to the commencement of this story, for when we get to the end we shall know more than we do now about a very wicked hobgoblin. He was one of the very worst, for he was a real demon. Wimmy gave a snort at that. One day, when he was in a merry mood, he made a looking glass which had the power of making everything good or beautiful that was reflected in it almost shrink to nothing, while everything that was worthless and bad looked increased in size and worse than ever, Mikasa read. The most lovely landscapes appeared like boiled spinach, and the people became hideous and looked as if they stood on their heads and had no bodies. Their countenances were so distorted that no one could recognize them, and even one freckle on the face appeared to spread over the whole of the nose and mouth. The demon said this was very amusing. When a good or pious thought passed through the mind of anyone, it was misrepresented in the glass, and then how the demon laughed at his cunning invention. She noticed how the girl with pigtails had stopped talking and was now listening to her read. Even the other blonde girl had turned her head to face Mikasa, her dull blue eyes on the book. Mikasa glanced back at Krista and Wimya, who were both watching her expectantly. She continued carefully. All who went to the demon's school, for he kept a school, talked everywhere of the wonders they had seen and declared that people could now, for the first time, see what the world and mankind were really like. They carried the glass about everywhere, till at last there was not a land nor a people who had not been looked at through this distorted mirror. They wanted even to fly with it up to heaven to see the angels, but the higher they flew the more slippery the glass became, and they could scarcely hold it, till at last it slipped from their hands, fell to the earth, and was broken into millions of pieces. What the hell is this story supposed to be about? Wimmy asked. You'll see, Krista whispered. Mikasa continued to read until her tongue was dry. She spoke with her voice soft beneath the lulling sound of chatter beneath them. She let the words pour from her mouth, and she read until finally Krista's eyes began to droop, and she fell asleep hunched over, listening to the low, empty sound of Mikasa's voice. When she finally did stop, it was growing late into the night, and Sesha had appeared on the loft as well. I'm stopping here, Mikasa said quietly, shutting her book and setting it beside her blanket. Fine. Wimmy glanced at Krista, who was leaning against her arm, her breathing shallow and soft. Guess I should go to sleep too. What story is that? The girl with pigtails whispered urgently. Mikasa was pretty sure her name was Mina. I've never heard it before. It's just a stupid fairy tale, Mikasa said. Even though she knew it wasn't. None of them were. Wasn't that why she kept the book around? The next morning she stood beside Armain, watching Eren with curiosity and trepidation. She didn't want to see him fail, but she knew it was a grave possibility. This was the test that decided if she would find Eren beside her when she joined the Survey Corps. She stared at him as he was lifted into the air. She could see every muscle shaking from the pressure as the boy struggled to hold himself upright. He held himself with such bitter determination that she almost smiled. There, she thought. That's no Lan. Around her trainees chorused, oh. Mikasa looked down at Armain, who looked so relieved she couldn't help but let herself relax. She was forced back into a state of tenseness as Eren's body flipped and his head smacked against the ground once again. Armin jumped beside her, his mouth falling open in shock. Mikasa looked away. Put him down, Shoddy said. Mikasa listened to her and protested profusely. She let herself get a look at him after he was set back on the ground. He looks terrified, Mikasa thought. It made her feel sick. But it might be for the best. Wagner, Exchange your equipment with Jaegers. Mikasa understood what he was doing, and suddenly she found herself second-guessing her initial perception of Eren Jaeger. Especially when he managed to hold himself upright with someone else's belt. She felt Armin slump beside her, and she closed her eyes. She would be seeing more of Eren, it seemed. If that look on his face isn't triumph, Armin said excitedly, I don't know what is. Mikasa folded her arms across her chest. He looks constipated to me. Armin blinked at her and laughed a little nervously as the two tall boys beside him glanced at her. The large blonde with a square face roared with laughter. His taller friend managed a weak smile, his brow furrowing a little, and Mikasa shook her head. Nonetheless, she was pleased with herself for making someone laugh. The true training began after that. Mikasa took no mind to it. She had known it would be rigorous, and she had been prepared. And she excelled. She could not fathom it herself, but it came like a second nature to her. Eren and Armin stuck close, though she found herself reluctant to spar with either of them. Especially Armin. It was difficult to be ruthless with him, and she could not be sure why. Please don't hold back, Armin said, taking a deep breath. Mikasa shifted her position, her head tilting as she watched his body. His muscles were tensing in preparation for her attack, and that wasn't good at all. She didn't want to hurt him. Are you sure? Mikasa asked. He nodded. I think, he said, if I can just, at the very least, react faster in situations. He bit his lip. How do you do it? I just do it. Mikasa didn't want to think about it. Okay, Armin said. He turned his back to her. Okay, go. Mikasa sighed. She would rather have Eren as a partner. It was fun to hear him curse after she flipped him. With Armin she just felt guilty and uncomfortable because it wasn't fair at all. He was a lot weaker than her, and she felt like she might break a bone if she kept flipping him onto his back. As she'd promised, she did not hold back. She had Armin on the ground before he could bat an eye, and she pinned his wrists above his head, digging her knee into his chest. Armin gave a little choking gasp of pain, wincing a little bit. Okay, he choked, maybe. This isn't working. Mikasa released him, and she crouched in the dirt for a few moments before wrinkling her nose. I shouldn't be your partner. I can't teach you how to fight. Well, Armin said, sitting up. He rubbed his chest, grimacing a little in pain. Maybe I can learn more about defense. I think I'd be happy if I could just dodge you. You can try, Mikasa said. She stood up, dusting off her knees. I'm sure if I just keep kicking the shit out of you, eventually you'll just be able to see it coming. Armin smiled weakly. Please don't let it come to that, he said softly. Why don't we switch? Mikasa offered. Do you think you can flip me? I'm not sure I could lift you. Armin laughed, scratching his head. His hair fell around his cheeks as he ruffled it nervously. Really? Mikasa considered this, and she watched Armin curiously. Try. Armin's smile fell. He stared at Mikasa for a moment, and then his eyes widened. Are you serious? He asked, his mouth falling open. I don't see why I'd be joking, Mikasa said. Try to pick me up. Armin looked a little horrified. He nodded distantly, and Mikasa moved closer to him, gesturing for him to turn around. He obliged reluctantly, and she studied his back for a few moments before planting her hands on his shoulders. He offered out his arms, giving her the signal to jump, and she did. Immediately he buckled under her weight. She wrapped her arms around his neck and rested her chin in his hair. She felt him stumble, but she waited it out anyway. Come on, she whispered into his ear. You can hold me longer than that. To her satisfaction, he held her for nearly a minute before she felt his legs nearly give out. Okay, Armin gasped. She jumped down and straightened out her jacket. She watched the boy double over, grimacing a little as he tried to level his breathing. He's weak, Mikasa observed, but not as weak as I thought. She was pleased with the revelation. Armin, Mikasa said softly. Which branch are you going into? Armin's shoulders tensed up. He was quiet for a few moments before straightening, running his fingers through his limp yellow hair. Well. He turned to face her, and he looked a little uncertain. I'm going to join the Survey Corps. Hearing that made her a little sick to her stomach. She wasn't sure why, but every time she heard that one of her peers was going to join the Survey Corps, she felt a sharp pang of fear fly through her. Was fate so cruel as to send her friends, only to send them alongside her to her death? She knew well that Eren and Armin had both faced the Titans before. That was much more than she could ever say. But still, it was a somber thought. She didn't want to lose Armin or Eren or anyone, but she was reminded of the stigma that plagued the very thought of the Survey Corps. The low survival rate and the unavoidable fate they were flinging themselves toward. Are you joining? Mikasa said quietly, because Eren is joining. Armin's brow furrowed behind his sweaty bangs. No, Armin said firmly. I have my own reasons, different than Eren, but maybe the same in some way. I don't know. I guess it'd be easier to just choose the garrison. He smiled faintly. It's tempting. You brave, Mikasa stated. He flushed, and she turned her face away. Don't get me wrong. You two are both fucking fools, and you'd be much better off in the garrison. But you both incredibly, stupidly brave. You never told us why you're joining, Armin said. He was still smiling, albeit tiredly. I did, didn't I? Mikasa frowned, and she thought back. Because I have no other choice. That's not a real answer, you know. No. Mikasa shrugged, and she began to play with the end of the braid. I don't really care. It's the answer you're getting. I'm sorry, Armin said, flinging his hands into the air. I didn't mean to pry. Mikasa stared at her ribbon and found herself a little bemused with herself. There was no shame in joining the Survey Corps because of Levi, that was certain, but she was still hiding it. Perhaps it was because Levi was making a name for himself already amongst the recruits. Of course, it wasn't until a later date that she realized the extent of his popularity. World's strongest soldier. Is that for real? It was the boy who had bumped into her the first night, smoking behind the barracks with a freckled boy by his side. Mikasa had been searching for Eren with Armin before dinner, and instead she found Jane Kirstein and Marco Bob leaning against the back wall of the barracks. Jean was the one smoking, a cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth, and smoke breathing into the late autumn air and mixing with the mist of Marco's breath. Jean looked at her, and his eyes widened a bit. Yeah, Marco said, I heard Connie talking about him. He's landed more Titan kills in a few months than most do in a year. He's one of the Survey Corps' best right now, I think. That caught Mikasa's interest. She turned to face them, tugging thoughtfully at her neckerchief, and she felt Armin stop beside her. He glanced up at her, and then at Jean and Marco. Hi, Marco, Armin greeted, waving meadily. Jean. Hi, Marco said, waving back. Jean seemed to be paralyzed against the wall, his eyes widening a little. What are you guys doing back here? Ah, Armin said, scratching the back of his neck. Looking for Eren. Have you seen him? Jean pulled his cigarette from his lips and blew smoke through the corner of his lips. Yeah, like would know where he is. He swallowed and looked away fast. He shoved his hand into his pocket and tore out a carton of cigarettes, shoving it into Mikasa's face. Smoke. Mikasa nodded, pushing the box open and pulling a cigarette out. Armin merely stared at her and then, very hesitantly, took one of his own. She recalled the first time she had smoked and mimicked what she had done then, only now she cupped the flame as she lit the end of the paper. When smoke filled her mouth, she spat it out without the same disgust that had been before. Of course, she still didn't like it. But at the very least it was easier to deal with than before. Armin coughed a little at his first drag, and so she clapped him on the back gently. You don't have to do it, Armin, Mikasa said, pulling the lit cigarette from her mouth. He coughed and shook his head. He spoke, and smoke billowed from his lips in a murky cascade. I'm fine, he rasped. Mikasa decided to believe him, and she turned back to Jane and Mako. She took a drag on the cigarette, letting it chill her nerves. She had yet to receive a single letter from Levi, and so it was a little disconcerting to hear anything about the Survey Corps. So, Mikasa said, blowing smoke into the wind. "Who are you talking about?" Jean blinked rapidly, and she watched the end of his cigarette wither. "Mako, who are we talking about?" The world's strongest soldier," Mako chirped. He didn't seem to mind all the smoke blowing in his face. Perhaps he was used to it. "His name is Levi." His eyes widened as he looked at Mikasa. "Oh." Smoke was stinging her eyes and tongue and lungs, and she stared up at them both for a few moments. "World's strongest soldier," she thought. "You're already a legend, Levi. So don't die. Don't be the stupid tin soldier who melts in the end." "Thanks," Mikasa said. She tossed her cigarette into the dirt and smothered it with her boot. Armin mimicked her, exhaling smoke a little easier now. She could tell by his expression that this was the first and last time he ever would try a cigarette, though. She turned around and began to walk away, Armin close at her side, watching her very carefully. "Are you two related?" Mako called out. Mikasa froze where she stood, staring ahead of her in shock. She whirled around, her brows furrowing a little as she studied Mako's innocent face. His freckles stretched across his cheeks as he smiled genuinely at her. "Why would you ask that?" Mikasa asked. "Because." Mako's smile was dampened a little by his confusion. "Well, you have the same last name." Mikasa stared at him for a few moments. In those moments, she could hear her heart pounding inside her head and taste the fresh tang of cigarette smoke as it clung to her tongue. She could feel the kiss of autumn wind on her cheeks, and she could feel Armin's stare burning into her shoulder blades. The gaze was too sharp, too curious, too knowing. It was beginning to scare her how well Armin could read her. "The same last name?" Mikasa asked. "Yeah." Mako said, blinking. "Levi Ackerman." She turned away from them. "I see," she breathed. She pulled her neckerchief up over her nose and she closed her eyes. She moved forward again without warning, and she walked fast, ignoring the shouts that called her back. "My last name," she thought wildly. "Does that mean we are family, Levi? But how could they be? Families talk to each other." Mikasa had scarcely any letters from Levi that year. "Mikasa." Armin stopped her by skidding in front of her, looking a little disgruntled. "Why didn't you say you had surviving family?" "Because I don't," Mikasa said. She watched his face fall into something akin to confusion. "But that guy they are talking about." "We aren't related," Mikasa said. "Oh." Armin shuffled his feet and glanced up at the dim evening sky. "The way you reacted." "It's hard to explain," Mikasa said, fidgeting with her neckerchief. "So you know him?" Mikasa nodded. She wasn't sure what else to say. Instead, she studied his face. "Are you okay?" she asked, prodding his chest. She felt him squirm a little at her touch, and he squeaked as he jumped back. "You didn't have to take a cigarette, you know." He looked at her with his blue eyes glowing against the blanket of shadows that buried them. In the bleary twilight, Armin's eyes searched her face, and they saw right through her. It made her acutely aware of just how clever Armin was, and she had to swallow the sudden fear that built up inside her chest. "Oh," she thought numbly, "why is he looking at me like that?" It was a strange sort of creeping feeling that stung her as Armin watched her. She wasn't used to anyone looking at her like they could read her thoughts, not even Levi. Armin laughed, and she relaxed almost immediately. "I was scared to say no," Armin admitted, rubbing his chest. "Mako wasn't smoking," Mikasa pointed out. "It wasn't a big deal." "I know," Armin said. "I guess I just wanted to prove something." "I don't know." "You don't need to prove anything." Mikasa let her arm fall back to her side. She turned her face up to the sky, watching as stars began to blink into slow, brilliant existence in the papery sky above them. "And yes, Yes. Yes, Mikasa said. I know him. Oh. He smiled at her and he looked around. I guess we should go find Eren. He's probably off taking a shit somewhere, Mikasa said. Mikasa, I'm inside, still smiling. Let's just go to dinner. She tugged at her neckerchief. Might as well. Dinner proved to be a bit of a bother. Marco and Jean came over immediately upon their arrival, and Armin glanced at Mikasa. She ate her broth in silence, staring at Jean with dull eyes. They watched each other, and Jean quickly looked down at his own food, tearing into his bread and looking away. Do I intimidate him? Mikasa wondered. Sorry to bother you about it, Marco said weakly. But you ran away so quickly, it just made us really curious. I'm not sure what you want to know, Mikasa said slowly. Who's Levi to you? Jean asked suddenly. Like a brother. Your father. Mikasa's spoon froze before her lips. She stared down at as she mulled over his words, feeling the word father chill her blood. Of course, back in Yulkil, Levi had been mistaken for her father more than once. Stefan had often just referred to him as her papa and nothing else. But they did not know Levi, and she wasn't sure if she wanted them to think of him as her father. Armin was watching her worriedly, and she watched her spoon drop into her bowl when he gently pressed his hand against hers. She opened her mouth and then snapped it shut. It's okay, Mikasa, Armin whispered. Yeah, Mikasa said quietly. She blinked up at Jean and Marco, who were watching her with a mixture of horror and confusion. Sorry. No, he's not my father. He's a friend. Who has the same last name as you? Jean asked slowly. She could sense how skeptical he was by the way his lips twisted. Levi doesn't have a last name, Mikasa said. I told him he could use mine if he wanted to. I had no idea he actually did. He didn't tell you? Marco asked, his eyes widening. He just took your last name. And you're okay with that? Jean cut in sharply. I told him he could, Mikasa said. She blinked at the two of them and picked up her spoon again. I wanted him to. And he's just a friend to you? Jean asked. She could feel him pushing the topic, and she couldn't be sure why. Just a friend, Mikasa said slowly, watching broth fill her spoon and letting it slowly dribble back into the bowl, might be understating it. So is he like your boyfriend? Jean asked so rapidly, she barely understood his words. What? She asked. She looked up at him blankly. Jean, Marco whispered, shaking his head. He smiled weakly at Mikasa and waved his hands quickly. Sorry for all the questions, Mikasa. We are really just curious. No, it's... She frowned and glanced at Armin. He was watching her and he shrugged. It's fine. I just don't understand where that question came from. Jean sat back and he winced. Yeah, sorry. I don't either. Levi's. She tugged at her neckerchief subconsciously. He's the closest thing to family I have. You asked me if he was my father. Mikasa looked pointedly at Jane. You weren't totally wrong. But calling him my father would be a lie. He cared about me, I'm sure, but with Levi it's very hard to tell. She found her thoughts drifting back to the day Levi had left. He hadn't said he would miss her. He hadn't shown much care that he might die. He just left her with a book and a goodbye, and not even a sorry. And in her most desperate moments, she wondered if she had imagined that he actually cared for it. If his moments of genuineness had all been a farce. It's been a very long time since I last saw him. I'm not sure anymore who he is to me. She knew, of course, that no matter what Levi did, she would be there. Because it didn't matter if he loved her with all that he could, or if she meant as little to him as a speck of dust he meant to wipe away at the soonest possible time. She would fight for him. That was the decision she had made. Hey. Mikasa snapped out of her reverie to see Eren standing behind Jane, his brow furrowed. Armin smothered a laugh in his hands as the boy's expression. What the hell is Horseface doing in my seat? Sit next to me, Eren, Mikasa sighed. Oh, Jean said, twisting to look at Eren. He had a strange, shit-eating grin on his lips. Is this your seat, Jaeger? Actually, Armin said. Yeah, Eren snapped. It is. No, it's not, Armin murmured. Well, I'm sitting here. Jean raised his head high and turned back to face Mikasa. Thank you, Mikasa, for telling me all of that. I know it's very personal. It's not a problem, Mikasa said distantly. Wait, what did you tell him? Eren leaned across the table, looking at her intently. Mikasa saw Jean grin against his cup, and he glanced between her and Armin, motioning behind Eren's back to keep silent. Mikasa shared a glance with Armin, and they both turned their heads down to their bowls as Eren repeated himself. No, seriously, what the hell did you tell him? Nothing, really, Mikasa said. It's not that interesting. Sit next to me, Eren. No, Eren said stubbornly. Not until I find out what you told him. Armin. It's not a big deal, Armin said slowly. If you sit down, I'm sure Mikasa will tell you. I would, Eren said stiffly, but someone is in my seat. Armin closed his eyes and shook his head in disbelief. Yes, Armin said, his eyes snapping open. Marco is. Eren froze. He looked down at the duo sitting in Mikasa and Eren's usual seats, and Mikasa was amused to find that Armin was right. Mikasa usually sat where Jean was sitting, while Eren sat in the seat where Marco resided. Mikasa watched Eren's face flush with embarrassment and Marco's face dawn with horror. Jean just looked confused and a little angry. Don't get up, Jean said briskly, grabbing Marco's shoulder when the boy scrambled to gather his food to move over. Don't give him the satisfaction. Marco looked at him and he smiled a little before shaking his head. No, I want to, Marco said. It'll give me the satisfaction of being polite. No, Marco, Eren said quietly. He sat down beside Mikasa, dropping his bowl in front of him and scowling at Jane. Don't get up, it's okay. Well played, Armin, Mikasa thought. They bumped their fists together beneath the table in their triumph. And somehow they went the entire dinner without Eren and Jean starting a brawl. Later that winter, Krista suddenly wanted Mikasa to read more of the fairy tale she had started the first night. Mikasa had no idea why, but she obliged, reading aloud from the book with a makeshift audience. Mikasa noticed Annie Leonhardt was among those sitting around her in a circle, listening intently to the story. When Krista fell asleep on Wimmy's shoulder, Mikasa decided to stop for the night, and she began to close the book. A hand shot out, slapping between the book as she snapped it shut. Mikasa looked up into Annie's icy blue eyes, which watched her without a flicker of emotion inside them. Keep reading, she said, her voice soft enough not to wake Krista, but hard enough to be commanding. And inside this mingled tone, there was a tiniest hint of a play. She read a little bit more before lights out. When she left the next morning for training, her book was beside her blanket as it always was. When she came back that afternoon, it was gone. And immediately she went into a panic. Krista. Mikasa called, running up to the tiny girl. Wimmy stopped as well when Krista turned to face her, and she jumped when Mikasa grabbed both her arms. Have you seen my book? I know I left it right next to my blanket, but it's not there. Did you take it? Yo, Wimmy said, taking Mikasa's shoulder. Hands off. Mikasa was a little shaken up about Wimmy grabbing her, but she had too much on her mind to lash out. So she let go of Krista and continued to stare at her desperately as the girl's eyes widened. And no. Krista gasped, blinking rapidly. No, I didn't. Something seemed to dawn on her, and she averted her eyes suddenly. Who did it? Mikasa asked, her body coiling with tension. Krista bit her lip anxiously, and there was a pause as she wrung her hands. Well, I don't know for sure, but... Mikasa asked through gritted teeth. But, Krista said softly, Annie was the one who asked me to ask you to read that story last night. Annie. Mikasa took a step back, her heart pounding in her ears. Thank you. Mikasa, wait. Krista cried, reaching after her. Don't. Mikasa bolted across the lawn, her braid trailing after her as she maneuvered between trainees being released from their various classes and exercises. She weaved around them, her eyes falling upon each of their faces as she glided past. Her goal kept her searching for about an hour before she was stopped by Armin and Eren. Are you okay? Armin asked worriedly. Mikasa was not listening, but rather looking around her for Annie's face. You look really. What are you looking for? Eren asked, cutting Armin off. Annie. Mikasa's fists clenched as she tried to steady her breathing. She is something of mine that I need back. Oh. Armin gasped. I just saw Annie. Mikasa looked at him sharply, while Eren glanced at Armin with raised eyebrows. You were with Annie just now? Eren asked. Yeah, I wanted to see what book she was reading. Where is she? Mikasa asked briskly. Armin stared at her with round eyes, and she could feel him taking in her ender and reading it as he did. There it was again. The uncanny ability to read her without even realizing it. So he nodded, his hair bouncing around his ears, and he turned around. I'll show you, he said, waving her forward. Just tell me, Mikasa hissed through gritted teeth. Armin shook his head and waved her forward still. It's better if I show you. Well, I'm coming, Eren said. He jumped to Armin's side, walking steadily in time with his smaller friend. He paused to glance back at her. Come on, Mikasa, doesn't Annie have something of yours? She exhaled furiously through her nose. Yes, she said. She started forward with them, and as they walked she began to cool down. She also began to put the pieces together. Annie wanted to hear the story last night, Mikasa thought, and she stole the book so she could finish it. It was almost enough for Mikasa to sympathize with her. But not quite. Because she'd still stolen something precious, and that wasn't easy to forgive. Mikasa was surprised to find herself standing on the roof of the girls' barracks as Armin settled himself beside the smaller blonde and whispered something to her. Annie did not react, but through her long bands Mikasa could see her eye flicker fast to look at her face. Mikasa slid down the side of the roof, mentally reminding herself over and over not to push the girl off. Annie, Mikasa said. The name felt chilly on her tongue as Annie met her gaze, her tired eyes hard and unyielding as they gazed at Mikasa's face. She held Mikasa's book in her hands, and it was open to the familiar story of the Snow Queen. Give me my book. Annie's jaw tightened, and Mikasa could almost see a flicker of emotion there. They stared at each other for nearly a minute, their glares measured and their faces blank. There was nothing between them but icy stares that flashed every so often with a bitterness. Annie snapped the book shut and handed it over without a word. Mikasa snatched it back, hugging it to her chest with her heart drumming against her chest and her eyes closing with relief. There was nothing more terrifying than finding that something irreplaceable had been ripped away. And there was nothing more soothing than feeling it being returned, the sudden rush of sweet reprieve as if nothing else in the world mattered. It's just a book, Mikasa reminded herself. But she was overwhelmed with the relief anyway. Annie stood up to leave, and Mikasa looked down at the book. Driven by impulse, she leapt to her feet as well, balancing herself easily on the slant of the roof. Annie, Mikasa said. I would have let you borrow it if you had asked. The girl froze. She stood in silence, facing Eren with her back turned to Mikasa and Armin. There was something undeniably cold about her, and with every moment that passed there was a bone-chilling finger of wind that stroked their faces. The shingles beneath them were slick with ice, but they were trained enough that they could handle it. I imagine, Annie said quietly, that it's too late to ask now. Yes. Mikasa's mouth felt dry. She watched Annie nod, and she began to trek carefully up the roof. Mikasa felt Armin's stare, and she gritted her teeth in frustration. I'm going to read it out loud again tonight, though. Annie seemed to consider this for a few moments before she turned away and slid off the roof, landing easily on her feet when they hit the ground below. Mikasa listened to her footsteps as they echoed in the winter air. She pulled her neckerchief up to her nose and she closed her eyes. She said. Armin looked a little apprehensive, his eyes following Annie's back. When I asked her. She didn't answer right away, and I'm really surprised that she did, to be honest, but she said that she never got to read stories like that when she was younger. Maybe that's why she stole it. I don't care, Mikasa said. She squeezed the book tightly, afraid to let it go. I don't care. You don't sound like you don't care. Hey, Eren said, sliding down the roof and halting himself between them. So can Armin and I listen to you read that story tonight? What? Mikasa asked dully. Me Armin. Eren made gestures with his fingers, his index and middle fingers darting across the air in a mimic of lakes. We sneak into the girls' barracks and listen to your story. That is a terrible idea, Mikasa said. I agree, Armin said feebly. What if we get caught? We are not allowed in each other's barracks after dark. If we get caught, Eren said, which we won't, by the way, then I'll take the fall. 2 rounds for both of us, I don't care. I'm not even sure you'd like the story, Eren, Mikasa said. If it's good enough to catch Annie's attention, Eren said, I want to hear it. Fine, Mikasa said. Do what you want. They looked out at the ground below, and Mikasa found herself reminiscing about the nights she spent with Levi on the roof watching the stars. She wondered what he was doing, and if he still watched the stars. She wondered a lot of things as time passed. She wondered why Levi didn't write. She wondered if she had angered him so much that he wanted nothing to do with her now. She wondered, and she hoped that she could amend for it. But even if she couldn't, it made no matter. Armin and Eren came and went undetected that night when she read the story. Annie listened, but from the edge of the loft with her back turned to Mikasa. Oddly enough, Armin and Eren kept coming back after that. When Mikasa finished her book of fairy tales, Armin brought other books. Of course, she let him read them because she was a little sick of her own voice by that point. By the next winter, they had somehow gotten away with sneaking in and out of each other's barracks numerous times. And more trainees joined in to listen to Armin read vivid descriptions of the outside world out of his thick tones, listen to him articulate orations from Mikaic histories, and listen to him speak with attentive eyes and ears. Mikasa preferred listening to Armin read than reading herself. He was a calming presence, and his voice was just as pacifying. His stories were strange, but wonderful, and she enjoyed them to a great extent. One night, however, Wimir tore the book out of Armin's hands and tossed it onto the ground. Hey! Connie cried, lifting his head from the pillow he'd been hugging. Sasha lifted her head grubbily beside him. Wimir! Krista gasped, jumping off a bunk and rushing to the tall girl's side. Mikasa just lay lazily beside Annie on the loft. They still didn't talk much, but Mikasa had more or less forgiven her in the year between the book incident and the carrot gathering. They were also the only ones who preferred to not be on the ground with the rest of the trainees. All right. Wimir called. She was hushed rather viciously by her peers, and she promptly ignored it. Everyone in a circle. We are playing a game. A game? Armin asked faintly from his spot on the ground. Your little history lesson is getting boring, Wimir said. It's time to have some fun. I'm having fun, Krista said, her voice very soft as she shot Armin an apologetic look. So am I, Marco said, smiling from the bunk beside Connie. I like these stories and the way Armin tells them. Armin, who was sitting on his knees, shot Marco a look of gratitude. Don't care. Wimir bent down and peered at the book. She pulled the clip from her hair, a leather frame with a wooden chip that held her hair within the frame, and she set the small spike of timber down on the book. Anyone gonna play? What is it, exactly? Armin asked. Oh, Krista said, staring down at the book. Her eyes widened. Oh, no, Wimir, I thought you were joking about this. Your mistake, Wimir said, smirking. She gazed around the room. I need a brave volunteer. There was silence throughout the room as they all looked around. Mikasa, out of curiosity, said up. You volunteering up there? Wimia called. No, Mikasa said. I'll do it. Mikasa watched as Jin pushed himself off the bunk below her, and he stepped up to Wimia. He raised his head high and shrugged. "K, what do I do?" "Spin the clip." Mikasa watched Krista take a very careful step away from the point of the wooden clip as Jin acquiesced. Just before the clip stopped spinning, Connie fell off his bunk in revelation. "This is spin the bottle," Connie cried. Mikasa watched Jin blanch a little as the clip came to a very gentle stop. "Are you kidding?" Jin asked flatly. "No offense, but no way." "You volunteered," Wimia said, grinning toothfully. She clucked Jin on both shoulders and shoved him forward. "Go get him, Tiger." "Wimia," Krista said, biting her lip worriedly. "Come on, this isn't fair." "It's only a game," Wimia said, folding her arms across her chest. She jerked her head up at Annie and Mikasa. "You two are next." "No," Mikasa said. Annie sat up beside her and watched Wimia with her icy blue eyes piercing downwards. Without a word she moved to the ladder and slid down it, peering at Jin as he stood rigidly. He looked a little uncomfortable. Krista said, her eyes flashing rapidly about the room. "How about a new rule? That the two people who get picked have to go outside for a minute. And we are not allowed to look." "Then how do you know if they did anything?" Connie asked. "You don't," Wimia said, her smirk widening. She caught Krista in a headlock and she nodded eagerly. "No, this is even better. Because no matter how much you deny nothing happened, there's no way to prove it." Jin said, glancing at Marco as the freckled boy stood up awkwardly. "It's cold outside. Get the hell out." "Fine," he said, his eyes narrowing. He marched forward, allowing Marco to slink behind him without much attention to the stairs. Mikasa sighed, and she really wished she could get away with just sinking into the wall behind her and not being part of this horrible little gang. However, that didn't stop her from following Annie down the ladder and standing stolidly as they all began to form a circle on the ground. "Do you think they're actually doing it?" Sasha whispered. "With Jane?" Connie shook his head. "Who knows?" The entire room was silent when Jin and Marco returned a minute later. Mikasa had no idea what had transpired beyond the door, and she could not guess. The flush on both their cheeks could easily be explained by the frigid temperature, and otherwise they looked no different from when they had left. That didn't stop Rena from giving a wolf whistle. Annie went next, flicking the wooden hairpin with little interest. It spun fast and then lazily for a few moments. There was no awkward smirks or giggling when the pin landed on Armin. Instinctively, Mikasa wanted to pull Armin out of the spotlight. She couldn't be sure why she was uncomfortable with the idea of it, but she didn't trust Annie with Armin. Anyone else, maybe, but not Annie. Maybe it was because of how much Armin trusted her. It was too strange to be sure. "Oh," Armin said quietly. He stood up. "Okay." Annie watched him with her gaze unchanging. Can Armin read her like he reads me? Mikasa wondered. She hoped so. She hoped that Annie felt the intensity of Armin's gaze and felt it sneak into her head and devour all her thoughts. Mikasa hoped that Annie knew just how smart Armin was. The boy knew more than he let on, but never let it slip. He could know anything and everything and hide it behind a shy smile. "This is a stupid game," Mikasa declared when they disappeared behind the door. "You next, Mikasa," Rena laughed beside her, elbowing her gently. "You ready for that?" "I'd rather go back to listening to Armin," Mikasa said dully. "Do you think they are doing anything?" Eren asked. "No way," Connie said. "Annie wouldn't let Armin make a move on her." "Armin wouldn't," Eren said. "Annie, I don't know." "They have like 20 seconds, Jin said, looking neither guilty nor sheepish. Mikasa did have to wonder if he and Marco had actually did anything outside or if they had just sat there and talked. She would have to assume the latter. "Mikasa, spin now," Wimia ordered. Mikasa glanced up at her and she felt a little uncertain as she reached forward and spun the clip. She sat back and watched it spiral, blurring into a circle of brown. She was not entirely certain she even knew how the game worked. When they went outside, they could do anything or nothing. It seemed a little abstract to her, and she couldn't grasp what the rules were exactly. She stood up and walked up to Eren. She couldn't find it in her to be surprised that the clip had landed on him. She saw him frowning a little as he stood as well, and he glared back at Wymir before following Mikasa to the door. They went over a minute, Krista said quietly from behind them. "What are they doing?" Connie wondered aloud. Mikasa and Eren glanced at each other. Mikasa opened the door enough for Eren to slip through without anyone else seeing outside, and then she promptly disappeared, closing the door swiftly. She was certain they had done it quick enough that no prying eyes had seen into the darkness. "You two got picked?" Armin asked. He was sitting on the steps, embracing his knees as snowflakes flooded in the lantern light. "Yeah," Eren said. He sat down beside Armin and rested his hand on his shoulder. "What happened to Annie?" "She left." Mikasa couldn't say she was surprised. She couldn't help feeling a bit irritated there. She set herself down on the other side of Armin, freshly fallen snow licking at the backs of her legs, melting against her thighs. Her loose hair was tickling her face, long strands catching against the wind and blowing about her head as the icy air bit at her cheeks. "It's a stupid game," Mikasa said. "Don't let it bother you." "Yeah," Eren said, bumping his shoulders against Armin's. "I'm pretty sure this dumb kissing thing is just Wymir trying to make us all really uncomfortable, or some shit like that." He poked up and shrugged. "It's probably better that you didn't." "We did, though," Armin said softly. His breath blossomed against the frigid night air visible under the saturated yellow lamplight. Mikasa and Eren shared another glance. "And she still ran off?" Eren asked, frowning now. "Maybe I'm just a bad kisser." The door opened behind them and Jean appeared in the entryway. Mikasa glanced at him as he drawled, "Time's up." "Give us another minute," Eren said, never looking away from Armin's face. The smaller boy tucked his chin to his chest and hugged his knees closer. "You had a minute," Jean said. "That minute's over." Mikasa stood up, dusting the snow off her skirt. She stepped back up onto the porch of the boys' barracks and she stood before Jean with her chin raised high. "One more minute," she said sharply. "Got it." He stared at her and his jaw clenched. Then he looked past her at Armin and his brow furrowed ever so slightly. She watched him exhale sharply, his nostrils flaring. "Fine," he said, spinning away from her. The door slammed in her face. Mikasa relaxed a little as she wandered back to Armin's side, steam flooding from her mouth as she spoke. "We can leave too," she offered. "I can grab my blanket. We can sit on the roof of the girls' barracks." "I think I just want to go to sleep," Armin admitted. He smiled up at her. "Thanks anyway, Mikasa." Mikasa considered this for a moment and she looked at Eren. He looked puzzled and a little angry. Perhaps at Jane for interrupting them, or at Annie for hurting Armin's feelings. Or perhaps at Armin for being so sad about the entire ordeal. Mikasa could not say. She was certain she didn't know Eren as well she could know him. And maybe that was her own fault. She could not say that she could really comfort Eren if he was sad or understand him when he was angry. She knew him as an impulsive oddity. A boy who had looked for her when she was missing, and a boy who had been inexplicably happy to find her after so many years. And that warmed her heart. She grasped Armin's chin and turned his head to face hers. He looked up with her with widening blue eyes, his lips parting to form a question. Very carefully, she stole that question from his lips. There was something very tender about it, very innocent and tentative as she felt her lips vibrate from the words Armin muffled against her. He blinked rapidly as she pulled back, still cupping the boy's chin. "I don't know, Eren," Mikasa said. She turned Armin's chin towards Eren, who caught her gaze. She wondered if he understood what she was doing. "I don't think Armin's a bad kisser." "Do you?" He smirked. Armin's entire body jolted as Eren planted both hands against his head and pulled him up to kiss him. Mikasa watched Armin's arms flail outwards in shock, and he sat back awkwardly when Eren released him. "Nope," Eren said. He was still smirking, his face flushed, and Armin sat stunned between them. He laughed a little, weakly at first, and then he had to muffle his giggles with his hands. "Thanks," he gasped, his face bright red. He shook his head, blinking rapidly and pushing himself to his feet. "I can't believe you two just did that." Eren and Mikasa shared another glance as he turned away from them. Mikasa pulled her neckerchief up to hide her smile. Armin went inside after that, but not before throwing them one last glance. He was smiling at them, and Mikasa stared ahead of her as she heard the door click shut behind them. They still had a few seconds left. She was well aware of it. "This is a really stupid game," Eren said from beside her. He'd scooted closer, his breath unfurling against the flood of winter air. Mikasa pulled down her neckerchief, icy fingers of wind touching her lips gingerly. Snowflakes danced around them, freckling the darkness and gathering against the windswept mass of hair bundled around her shoulders. "Yeah," Mikasa said. She felt him beside her, very warm in spite of the winter chill. She could almost feel the mist of his breath. "It's really stupid." She kissed him. It was all her, and she had justified it by telling herself that she could easily die with him at a later date. It was only fair to kiss him. He tasted like pure warmth, and that made the kiss more heated and less innocent than the one with Armin had been. And in a few seconds, she felt Eren carefully apply pressure back to her lips, his fingers tangling in her hair when he reached for her shoulder. Mikasa saw snowflakes clumping in his eyelashes as they grazed her skin. The mist of their breaths blinded them as it blew about their cheeks, and by the time the door behind them opened again, they were back to staring out into the dark night around them. Snow melted in their hair as they stood up, never speaking, and went back inside. Mikasa had neither sent nor received any letters to or from Levi in her time training. She'd intended to, but her heart wasn't in it. Everything she wrote never felt right. Instead, she wrote to Greta and received some letters in return. The woman seemed grateful that Mikasa bothered to keep in touch, and that made Mikasa happy. Sometimes she felt that she had taken Greta's hospitality for granted. It had not been the woman's fault that Levi had left, and Mikasa often thought about how difficult she had been with Greta for no reason at all. It was said, not knowing if she'd ever see the barmaid again. Near to graduation, Mikasa was surprised by a visit from a high-ranking soldier of the Survey Corps. The trainees were abuzz with rumors as to why she was there, if she was trying to gain recruits or if there was an actual issue. Mikasa watched her speak with Keith Shoddies for a little while, and she noticed how eccentric the woman's movements were as she spoke. She couldn't help a thought surfacing in her mind. I wonder if she knows Levi. Mikasa was further surprised when the woman plopped down across from her at dinner. She'd looked up sharply, sitting up straight as she acknowledged all the eyes on her. The woman especially had an intense gaze, brown eyes wide and searching Mikasa's face. She had an air of undying curiosity, and it gleamed inside her eyes without fail. And then the woman smiled. "It's so strange," she said, cupping her chin pensively. "He said you aren't related, but I could almost swear you look alike." Mikasa felt her heart jump into her throat. She dropped a spoon, and she nearly jumped to her feet with excitement. 1,000 questions congealed on her tongue, sacking heavily in her mouth. In the end, she could only utter one. "You know Levi?" Mikasa gasped, her eyes flashing wide. The woman nodded fast, still smiling. "He's actually the reason why I'm here." She shook her head. "When he found out I was scheduled to pass near here, he asked me to find you." "Me," Mikasa repeated softly. "Does that surprise you?" The woman grinned, and she rested her chin in her hands. "It's funny, since I think you're the only person he really overtly shows affection for." Affection? Mikasa didn't know what to say. Was this woman serious? Levi wasn't affectionate, not really. It occurred to her that maybe they had different definitions of the word affection. In truth, Mikasa associated the word with the foreign sensation of a hug. "Oh, hey." The woman leaned forward, pointing to Mikasa's neckerchief. "You're actually wearing it." Mikasa touched the fabric and subconsciously tugged it to her lips. She looked down at her plate, and she had to wonder just how well this woman knew Levi. She was wild and strange, and her curiosity had no bounds. Mikasa was unsure of how to approach her or how to approach the situation at hand. "Levi made it," Mikasa said. "Why wouldn't I wear it?" "I'm just surprised," the woman said, smiling. "Oh. I'm Zoe Hange, by the way." "Zoe," Mikasa said slowly. "Hange is fine," Hange said. She watched Mikasa for a few moments, and her eyes softened a bit. "I know it's not fair to ask, but do you know what branch she'll be joining yet?" "Yes," Mikasa said. "I'll be joining the Survey Corps." Hange continued to smile. "Because of Levi," Hange said, "right?" Mikasa stared at the brunette. "Because I want to protect him," Mikasa wanted to say. "Because I owe him my life, and I would gladly give it to save him. It means nothing without him." But she couldn't. She couldn't speak. Maybe she was scared to admit any of it, or maybe she just wasn't so sure she wanted to be on this path. "At any rate," Hange said, "I know he worries about you. He won't say it, or even really emote it, but it's easy to tell when he's worried. He's simultaneously quieter and more talkative." Hange paused, and she scratched her head. "You know what I mean." "Yes," Mikasa said. A trickle of warmth blossomed inside her chest, and she sunk against the bench. "When he has a lot on his mind, he'll talk a lot but never really say anything." Hange's smile widened. She pulled out an envelope and slapped it on the table. "Well," she said, rising to her feet. "I really need to get going, since this detour was unscheduled. I've got a lot of work to do and stuff, you know." She waved offhandedly. "I hope to see you soon, Mikasa." "Yeah," Mikasa said vacantly. She lifted the envelope up and stared at it for a long time. As Hange moved, Mikasa felt herself spring to her feet. "Wait. Hange, can you tell Levi something for me?" Hange turned to face her. She smiled and stuck her hands into her pockets. "Sure," she chirped. "What do you want me to tell him?" "Tell him." Mikasa felt her heart thudding as she tried to breathe, tried to speak. She was losing her mind in a struggle to keep calm. Tell him I love him. I miss him." Hange's smile only widened. Mikasa managed to relax a little when she nodded profusely. "Of course," Hange said, looking as though she wanted to laugh. "He misses you too, you know." "Yeah." Mikasa sat down, and she let her fingers gingerly run across the ends of the envelope. "Thank you." "Not a problem." Hange studied her face. She grinned and waved. "Bye." "Bye." Mikasa watched her leave, her eyes glowed to her back. The wings of freedom were burned into her mind, and she could almost feel them. Feathers fluttered against her shoulders, against her cheeks, and she could taste them molting inside her mouth. She could see them wilting against rain, frosting against snow, whipping against wind. She could feel them digging into her back, growing stunted and weak. She didn't open her letter. She was still staring at it when Eren and Armin showed up 10 minutes later, excitedly asking about the woman from the Survey Corps who had come to speak with her. Mikasa didn't have much to say. She was too busy mulling over what Levi could possibly have written. Was it an apology for not riding? Was he forgiving her for joining the military? Could the words printed on the page be any worse than what she had imagined? She was stunned by her reluctance and stunned even still by her lack of faith. She didn't want to know what Levi had to say. "Mikasa, are you even listening?" Eren asked. Mikasa sat stolidly, her eyes cast toward the letter. "I'd apologize," she said, "but I'm not sorry." "What is that?" Eren pointed to the letter, ignoring her coarse behavior. Armin sat across from them, looking between them with anxious eyes. "Nothing that concerns you." Mikasa took the letter and slipped it into her lap. "Did that lady give it to you?" Eren, Armin said, "Stop being nosy." She obviously doesn't want to tell you anything. Mikasa nodded to Armin gratefully as Eren sat back. He looked a little sullen. Mikasa went through the rest of dinner sitting very quietly, staring at the envelope. How bad could it be? What if it wasn't bad at all? What am I so afraid of, anyway? She set the envelope, seal unbroken, in her book of fairytales. She did not read it until the night before the disbanding of the 104th Trainee Corps. As Eren and Jean went at it again at their last dinner as a unit, Mikasa slipped the envelope out of the book. Reyna was mopping up the drink he'd snorted into Armin's hair, which left everyone around her distracted. She knew she would have to read the letter before she joined the Survey Corps and saw Levi again. Her time was up, and her stomach was churning nervously. She opened the envelope and tentatively unfolded the paper. The corners of her lips twitched at the familiarity of Levi's closely knitted, thickly scrolled handwriting. She found herself muddled in a bout of nostalgia, taking measures to circle every word that Levi wrote. It wasn't so long ago that her life had revolved around waiting for these letters to arrive. Short and matter-of-fact, never overtly containing emotion. Mikasa could tell Levi's hand by glancing at the way he strung words about. There was no need for a signature. Mikasa, you made a mistake in joining the military. There is no comfort here and a lot of loss. You've lost so much already, been through too much shit, and I can't understand why you would risk everything just to lose more. Mikasa almost wanted to stop there. Her heart was thudding in her chest, and she had known that it was coming, but even so she was sad to see the words written. She looked up at Jane and Eren, their argument a stream of words rushing past her, inaudible and thrumming. She felt as though she was dreaming. Except, Levi wrote, the worst thing is, I do understand. I fucking hate it, but I understand your ass-backwards logic. You didn't make the mistake, Mikasa. It was me. I can accept it. I was responsible for you, and I left you to fulfill a selfish desire. Do you remember when I left, and I asked if you hated me? I wish you said you did. You should hate me for abandoning you, and you should hate me for being a piece of shit of a human being for so long. When I found you, I had every intention of selling you. You know that, right? I would have sold you if you had been a little older. Does that make you hate me? If it doesn't, I won't be surprised. But I hope it does. I want you to hate me because I don't want you to care about the man who nearly sold you like a fucking pig for slaughter. Mikasa took a deep breath and she turned the page over feverishly. I can't deny that since meeting you, I've become a better person. But only recently has the glass been torn from my eyes. I see how terrible I was. To you, mostly. You didn't deserve to have me looking after you, and I want you to hate me for putting you in danger, for making you complicit in crimes, for not being there. The world is cruel, and we both see it. It is disgusting and ruthless, but I think you made it better. I was in a very bad place. You can say I had a shard of glass in my heart and in my eyes, and I had little faith in humanity. You made me see the world clearer, and I'm thankful, but that doesn't mean I want to see your blood suck what little beauty there is left. I know by the time you read this letter, you'll probably be near done with your training. I'll admit, it took me a while to write. I hate this situation, and I hate pointless deaths. All I have ever wanted from you, Mikasa, is to see you live. You don't need to be near me. It's too late, I know. I know that I can't change your mind. I don't think I can make you hate me either. But you don't need to do anything for me. I just want you to be breathing, and that's all the thanks I need from you. Take care. Levi. There was warmth tingling her cheeks as she smiled and closed her eyes. Thank you, Levi, Mikasa thought. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the rise and fall. Thank you for everything. Mikasa? Armin asked, his voice heightening in shock. Mikasa, what's wrong? She shook her head, wiping at her eyes. She didn't trust herself to speak. Her eyes snapped open and her heart thudded in her chest. Eren had spun around to face her, and she saw all his rage at Jean disappear as he leaned across the table, his brows furrowing. Are you Eren looked surprised. She wiped her eyes on her sleeve and stood up. She folded the letter and moved quickly. She didn't know how to explain her tears, and she was scared of Eren and Armin. Because she let them know her. And she knew that they could see her heart and all the filth that she had allowed to gather there. Eren grabbed her arm, swerving his body when her leg flew out. His entire body buckled, and he dropped to the ground when her shin connected with his knee instead of his groin. She stared at him, tears glistening in her eyes as he knelt, still clutching her arm. She blinked rapidly as the hole quieted, and she bent down before Hen. "Why the hell are you crying?" Eren asked through gritted teeth. He was wincing from pain. "I don't know," Mikasa whispered. She shook her head and forced the tears away. "Did I hurt you?" "Nah." He let her help him back to his feet anyway. He studied her face and he gave a teasing smirk. "You not scared, are you?" "I don't know," Mikasa said honestly. "You can't be," Eren said firmly. "You're the strongest person I've ever met. So you've got to stay strong. Or else what the fuck are people like me and Armin supposed to do? I mean, we ain't weak, but we sure as hell ain't you." "I can be scared," Mikasa said, "and I can be strong." "Okay," Eren said, smiling at her. "Good to hear." Her mind felt frenzied from the letter. She was stewing in her own unbridled emotions, and she took Eren's hand. "I can be scared," she said distantly, "and I can still protect the things I care about. Can't I?" "If anyone can," Eren said, "it's probably you." She looked between Eren and Armin, and she nodded. "Thank you," she said. She blinked, and she turned away. "I need to go do something. I'll be back in a little bit." Eren let go of her, and she whirled around, pulling up her neckerchief over her mouth. When she returned from her room, she found Eren outside the party hall beside Armin and a tall man. As she approached, she watched Eren fall to his knees, clutching his head. She ran to Armin's side, her long hair streaming behind her, and she stared at Eren as he trembled. "What's wrong with him?" Mikasa asked. I don't know," Armin said weakly. "He just..." "Eren." Mikasa bent down beside him, her hand landing on his back. She could feel his entire body buckling as he held his head, sweat appearing on his brow. His voice was reedy and thin, shaking from pain. I am fine, but don't ask me why. My head feels like it's gonna split apart." She looked into his eyes and saw that they were watery and glistening. "And yet, I can't remember anything." Mikasa caught him as he fell against her, his entire body quaking. Armin supported Eren's head, cradling it as he fell limp. Mikasa quickly checked his pulse, and her body slackened with relief when she felt it drum steadily against the sweat-slicked skin of Eren's neck. "What the fuck did you do, old man?" Mikasa asked the stranger sharply. She hovered over Eren defensively, her resolve only strengthening. "I'll protect everyone I care about," Mikasa swore. "No matter what." "Mikasa?" Armin gasped. He shot the man an apologetic look. "Hans, this is Mikasa Ackerman." The man's frantic expression transformed as he looked at her. "The missing girl?" he asked, bending down before them. His eyes widened. "Damn, that's some luck that you all ended up together." Mikasa said nothing. She scooped Eren into her arms, ignoring Hansa's surprised shout, and she looked down at Armin. "Where are you sleeping?" Armin stood up, waving her forward. "Come on, I'll show you." Eren shuddered in her arms, and she raised her head high. He felt light as a feather compared to Levi. She laid him out on his bed, and she pressed her hand to his forehead. "He feels warm," Mikasa said, turning to face Armin. Hans stood in the doorway, looking concerned. "And gross. Do you think he's sick?" Armin asked worriedly. He touched Eren's forehead as well, and Mikasa watched him frown, his thick eyebrows knitting together. "I don't know," Mikasa said. "I don't think so." "It came on suddenly, didn't it?" "Yeah," Armin said. "When Hans brought up his dad." Mikasa bit her tongue to keep herself from reacting at the mention of Grushieda. It was still a sore topic. She would rather forget everything that had happened that day, but she couldn't help but associate Eren's father with the slaughter of her family. She nodded and she turned away. "It's late," she said quietly. "I'm going to go to bed. I'll see you tomorrow, Armin." "Okay," Armin said, sitting down tentatively at the edge of Eren's bed. "See you." She passed hands by, moving from the room fast. She was worried about Eren, yes, but she was certain the boy was too stubborn to succumb to something so feeble as an illness. And even if his condition worsened, Mikasa was aware of the ways in which she could procure something to save him. But she was certain it was nothing life-threatening. Or at the very least, she hoped. She didn't find out until the next day that the Survey Corps was in trust. And they were preparing to leave for an expedition. Mikasa found Eren, who was much better after whatever had happened the night before. Armin wasn't far behind, and she listened to them talk about the Survey Corps while they walked to the gate of Wall Rose. She waited anxiously, clutching a piece of paper in her hand and watching the road. She knew Eren and Armin were watching her closely, and so she kept her face impassive. She couldn't let them know how nervous she was to see Levi again. When the sound of horses shuddered through the air, Mikasa felt her body coiling. She wasn't sure if she had the urge to run toward the horses or away from them. "Mikasa," Armin murmured beside her as the people around them chattered about the approaching Survey Corps. She shook her head. She watched as the men and women strained by, and she bounced on her feet, feeling uncertain as her eyes flickered through the faces. She saw Hange, and then she began to move. She walked along with the trotting horses at first, craning her neck to get a good look at all the soldiers. Eren and Armin stayed behind, but Mikasa could hear him shouting after her. She spotted Levi as the troops halted before the gate. She recognized him immediately, his stature and his hair and his posture. She knew Levi well enough to catch him by his back. She could hear the crowd around her chatter restlessly. "What is that girl doing?" She squeezed through the troops, ducking under horses and weaving between soldiers. "Hey," a man gasped. "Hey, girl. You shouldn't be here." She might have flicked him off if her mind wasn't focused on Levi's back. She moved swiftly, dodging and maneuvering almost as she would if she was using her three-dimensional gear. She was so enwrapped in her goal, she couldn't be bothered. She flicked over a horse or two on her way to Levi's side. When she reached it, her heart was pounding so hard that she could feel it drumming inside her throat. Her legs felt a little weak, and she found herself bolting to attention when his head turned and he looked down at her. His eyes were the same shadowy blue they had always been. There was a surplus of circles under his eyes, but that was the only difference she could see in his appearance. He held himself with the same air of confidence, and he had the same hardened expression he always wore. Her breath caught in her throat. Everything she'd been dying to say for 5 years knotted up on her tongue. Her mind had drawn up a blank for her, and she took a deep breath, feeling his gaze as it searched her face. There was shock in his eyes, deep in the recesses of them. The way his brows moved told her so. Mikasa thumped her fist against her heart, and she folded her other arm behind her back. She raised her head to him, bits of hair framing her face, and the rest tightly braided at her back. "Hello, Levi," Mikasa said. She saw Hange peer over Levi's shoulder, and the woman smirked. "Or should I call you Captain Levi?" Levi studied her face, and she grew restless as she watched him. She was keenly aware of her thundering heartbeat, and it made her even more anxious than she already was. Had she always been so nervous around Levi? No, she was certain it was just because it had been so long. It was strange to think that she had only spent a year with Levi and 5 years away from him. "No," Levi said. His voice was low, empty of emotion, and so soft she had to close her eyes. "Don't call me that." Mikasa nodded. She took a deep breath, and she lifted her fist from her heart to reach behind her. She tugged the ribbon from her hair and felt the tight braid loosen around her shoulders. Her hair tumbled against her cheeks, and she hesitantly reached up, sliding the red ribbon around Levi's bicep. He made no move to stop her, but merely watched, just as his fellow soldiers watched with a mixture of awe and confusion as she gripped his arm with both hands. She pressed the paper she'd been clutching against his upper arm and tied the ribbon into a bow around it. I need you to promise, Mikasa said, pulling the ribbon taut, that you won't die today. Don't be stupid, Levi said. His eyes never left her face. I'll be back. We have a lot to talk about. Promise me, Mikasa said. She could feel herself growing desperate, and she squeezed Levi's arm as she bowed her head. Please. I need you to say it. Fine. Levi's jaw tightened. I promise I won't die today. Mikasa exhaled, and her body relaxed. She stared at the red ribbon, and she nodded, her hair curtaining her face. Then I'll see you soon, Mikasa said. She was surprised when he took her hand and nodded, his face turning out toward the gate. His hand moved from her hand to the ribbon and then finally to the note she had stuck in the burr. She turned away, not wanting to be around when he read it. She cut through the stationary horses, tucking her loose black hair behind her ears and taking a deep breath. She began walking slowly back to where Eren and Armin were. She saw that they had moved closer and were coming to meet her. She saw Eren throw his arms into the air, which she read as, "What the fuck was that, Mikasa?" She waved at him, feeling as though a weight had been lifted off her chest. Mikasa? Levi's voice had her freezing in her tracks. She watched Armin and Eren freeze as well, their expressions blooming with shock. Mikasa whipped around, her hair smacking against her face. She was reminded that Eren had once told her that it was too long. Perhaps he was right. She pushed it out of her eyes and blinked down at Levi as he very swiftly approached her. He was in a hurry, and she could sense it in the way he moved, in the murmurs and the confused words that burst through the crowd. She couldn't help but be stunned by how suddenly very small he looked. Levi seemed to have the same stunned revelation as he stared up at her. "You've grown," he said. She knew he had said it without thinking, by the alarmed look in his eyes. "Yes," Mikasa said. She glanced at the restless Survey Corps, and she nodded. "That tends to happen with time." "You're a shit-eater, you know that," Levi said. He was staring at her, and she knew he wanted to say something. She knew it was about her note, and she couldn't help but smile a little. He looked away for a few moments, his face turning back toward the front of the mass of soldiers. Mikasa saw a blond man looking at them, his eyes watching them with an inscrutable sort of wisdom to them. She could sense it even from the distance, and it unnerved her. "I have to make this quick, or Owen will piss himself from having to wait." The name prickled Mikasa's memory. Owen. Mikasa blurted. Her mind drew back to the repetitive words she had found in Levi's old room. "Kill Owen." Shock had her by the throat as she tried to put the pieces together. "Yeah." Levi shook his head. "We can talk about him later." He reached up and grasped her by the shoulders, pulling her head down so it rested against his shoulder. She thought that her legs might give out as she stared ahead of her, her lips pressing against the fabric of his green cloak. Her eyes were wide, and her arms felt heavy as she wrapped them around his torso. He took her hand, and she felt the crumpled note dig into her skin as he squeezed her knuckles. She understood what the return of the note meant. And she smiled into his shoulder, squeezing her eyes shut. It felt warm to have a family. And it felt warm to be loved. Levi pulled back first, his hand brushing against her bowed head, and he mussed her hair gently. It made her feel a bit like a child, but she was too happy to care. He took a step back. "Thank you, Mikasa," he said, his soft voice drifting as he took another step back. She raised her head, and she almost laughed. Mikasa smiled tremulously, tears building inside her eyes as he turned away from her, and she watched him pause for just a moment when she said, "Don't."